The divorce papers had just been signed, and the husband coldly threw out his final words, "Pack your things and get out of my house." But just minutes later, this very same woman rolled her suitcase to the massive mansion directly across the street, opened the wrought iron gates with her own passcode, and left everyone speechless with shock. She, Catherine Sterling, was once considered a freeloader, betrayed and erased from the life of the man she loved more than anything. But no one knew that behind her silence lay her true status and a master plan that would make everyone pay the ultimate price. Today, our podcast brings you a story about a woman who walked the path from humiliation to the very top, and how traitors paid dearly for their actions. Was her silence a sign of weakness, or was it the quiet before a painful revolution? What would you choose to forgive, or to get even? Leave your comments and share your thoughts. It was a surprisingly quiet afternoon in the elite gated community of Atherton, California. Beyond the gates, leaves merely rustled under light gusts of wind. Inside a 3-story modern estate, which on paper was the joint property of the spouses, the atmosphere was thick and heavy, like the calm before a storm. On the glass coffee table in the middle of the living room lay a neat stack of papers. The top sheet was the divorce petition. Catherine Sterling sat perfectly straight on the designer sofa, her hands resting on her lap. She wore a simple cream-colored sheath dress, her hair pulled back into a low ponytail. She wore almost no makeup. She looked so remarkably calm that it bordered on ice, contrasting sharply with the impatient glare of the man standing opposite her. Derek Vance loosened his silk tie, his voice laced with irritation. "I've made myself perfectly clear. Just sign it. Let's not waste each other's time." Catherine raised her eyes to the husband she had lived with for 3 years. It was the same face, the sharp jawline, the dark brows, the solid, handsome exterior she had once believed would be her anchor for life. Only now, there wasn't a drop of warmth in his eyes. It was the look of a man staring at an old, worn-out piece of furniture he couldn't wait to throw out. Sitting next to Derek was his mother, Nancy. Leaning back in the armchair and fanning herself with a magazine, she twisted her lips into a venomous smirk. "Sign it quickly, honey. No matter how much you drag this out, you can't hold on to him. A woman needs to know her place when she's outlived her usefulness. You should learn to make a graceful exit." Catherine didn't reply. She looked down at the divorce papers, at the crisp black ink. Husband's name, wife's name, reason for divorce, irreconcilable differences, loss of affection. She suddenly found it hilarious. Loss of affection. Since when could a marriage destroyed by betrayal, neglect, and coldness be summarized by such a polite legal phrase? Thinking she was hesitating, Derek frowned. "Catherine, stop playing the victim. I'm exhausted. It's over. Pack your things and get out of my house." The phrase wasn't shouted, but every word sliced like a scalpel through the last layer of the woman's composure. Out of my house. For 3 years, she had lived here as a devoted wife, personally picking out every drape, every piece of fine bone china. On those nights when Derek ran a high fever from overworking, she stayed up until dawn changing his cold compresses. Back in the days when his startup was barely surviving and money was tight, she had quietly sold her late mother's vintage Tiffany diamond set without a single complaint. And today, he says, "Out of my house." Nancy, emboldened by her daughter-in-law's silence, piled on, "You've been riding our coattails for 3 years. It's time you showed some dignity. This house has put a roof over your head and food on your plate. You couldn't even give him a child. You did absolutely nothing for my son's career. Keeping you here is just a waste of space." The word freeloader made the corners of Catherine's lips curl into a barely noticeable smile. The day she decided to quit her high-paying job at a major San Francisco media firm to help Derek build his own tech construction business, this very same Nancy had held her hands and tearfully said, "What a blessing for this family to have such a selfless daughter-in-law." Now, that same woman sat before her, coldly erasing all of it. Catherine looked up. Her voice was quiet but razor-sharp. "Are you finished?" Her mother-in-law stumbled over her words, clearly not expecting Catherine to possess the poise to ask such a polite question today. Derek scoffed. "What else is there to argue about? I'll leave you enough money in the settlement to rent an apartment for the first few months. Just don't make a scene and embarrass us both." "Embarrass?" Catherine repeated, barely above a whisper. Her gaze fell to his shirt collar, where a long chestnut hair was still visible. It wasn't her hair color. For a very long time, Catherine had known there was someone else in her husband's heart. The first time, it was the sickeningly sweet scent of a stranger's perfume on his blazer when he returned late from a business trip. The second time, it was a notification on his locked iPhone screen while he was in the shower. "Are you asleep yet? I miss you so much." The third time shattered her illusions completely. She had seen Derek holding Valerie Pierce by the waist as they walked out of a Michelin star restaurant in the city, looking at her with a tenderness Catherine hadn't seen in years. She knew everything. She just never asked. Because from the moment she saw the care with which he opened the car door for another woman, Catherine realized something. Some marriages don't die on the day the papers are signed. But long before, silence hung in the living room. Outside, a community security patrol buggy drove past the gates and paused. The guard seemed to be chatting with a housekeeper from the next estate over. "Man, what's all the shouting over at the Vance place? Who knows? I just hear Nancy yelling her head off." These mundane, everyday sounds piercing through the glass made the moment even more bitter. It turned out that while one family's world was collapsing, the outside world remained entirely ordinary. Catherine picked up the pen. Derek stared at her hand, as if terrified she might change her mind. But no. The second the tip of the Mont Blanc pen touched the paper, she signed everything in one swift motion. No trembling hands. No hesitation. Catherine Sterling. Her handwriting was soft, neat, and elegant, just like she had been in this marriage. Restrained, patient, never showing off. Having signed, she put the pen down. Done. Just one word. No tears, no begging to stay, no questions about whether he had ever truly loved her. It was precisely this eerie calm that infuriated Derek. He had expected accusations, hatred, or at least a few tears that would prove he still mattered to her. But there was nothing. Her silence was a phantom slap to the face. Nancy cleared her throat, trying to reclaim her sense of superiority. "Well, since you've signed it, go pack your bags. And make sure you don't take anything valuable. Anything bought with my son's money stays here." Catherine stood up. She swept her gaze across the living room. The designer wall clock she had picked out. The crystal vase on the console table where she arranged fresh flowers every Sunday. The spot on the wall where their wedding photo used to hang, leaving only a blank hook. She gave a slight nod. "Don't worry. I'll only take what's mine." As she walked past Derek, he couldn't help but speak up. "Catherine." She paused, but didn't turn around. His voice hardened. "Don't ever interfere in my life again." There was a long pause, and then Catherine let out a soft laugh. The laugh was very quiet, very light, but it sent a sudden chill down Derek's spine. "Don't worry," she said. "As of today, your life is none of my business." 20 minutes later, Catherine descended the sweeping staircase with a beige Samsonite carry-on. She didn't have much. A few changes of clothes, her personal documents, a small wooden lockbox, and an old leather-bound journal she always carried. She walked through the living room one last time. Nancy stood with her arms crossed, huffing coldly. Derek stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, refusing to look at her. Catherine wrapped her hand around the suitcase handle. The wheels rolled across the gleaming hardwood floor, emitting a steady, rhythmic hum slowly severing her past, step by step. At the front door, she paused for a second. The evening California breeze swept in, tossing a strand of hair against her cheek. Her face remained remarkably serene. No one knew what she was thinking. No one knew how a woman who had just walked out of a shattered marriage could be so cold-blooded. She lifted her head and looked straight across the manicured street of the estate community. Her gaze was quiet, yet so deep it was impossible to read. Then Catherine rolled her suitcase and stepped forward without looking back. Behind her, the door to One Life had just slammed shut. But ahead, another door was prepared. The golden California sun filtered through the massive oak trees lining the avenue, creating a web of light and shadow. Catherine walked neither too fast nor too slow. Every step was deliberate, as if she had been preparing for this exact moment for a very long time. Behind her, the gates of Derek Vance's property hadn't fully closed. Nancy stood on the porch, hands on her hips, refusing to go back inside. "Leaving? Then leave for good. What are you loitering for?" she barked, intentionally raising her voice. Derek stood a few steps behind his mother. He remained silent, but his eyes followed the retreating silhouette of his ex-wife. Deep down, he felt a bizarre sensation, not quite regret, not quite relief, just anxiety. Catherine didn't look back. She rolled her suitcase straight ahead, but not toward the community's exit, as everyone expected. She turned onto the wide driveway directly across the street. Right in front of her stood another estate, a sprawling, ultra-modern architectural masterpiece with massive, glossy black wrought iron gates. This property had long been the subject of local gossip, as its billionaire owner rarely, if ever, made an appearance. Pete, the community security guard sitting in his patrol buggy nearby, jumped a little when he saw Catherine heading that way. Mrs. Vance, Catherine, he called out. You've got the wrong house. Catherine stopped in front of the towering gates. She didn't answer right away. She merely adjusted her grip on her luggage. Across the street, Nancy also noticed, her brows knitting together. What on earth is that girl doing? Derek took a step forward, his gaze sharpening. Catherine reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a sleek, silver remote. There was a faint electronic chirp. The massive gates before her smoothly glided open, and the air around them seemed to freeze. Pete the guard stood up, his eyes wide. What is going on? From inside the estate, a private security guard in a crisp, dark suit hurried out. Seeing Catherine, he immediately bowed his head. Good evening, Miss Sterling. Welcome back. His voice carried deep, undeniable respect. This wasn't a standard greeting. Catherine gave a slight nod. Yes, I'm back. She rolled her suitcase through the gates. Her movements were entirely natural, as if she owned the place because she did. On the other side of the street, Nancy was paralyzed. Derek, she stammered, turning to her son, her voice cracking. She's walking into someone else's house. Derek didn't answer. He stood rooted to the spot, unable to tear his eyes away from the unfolding scene. There could be no mistake. The way the guard bowed, the way her remote opened the gates, the way Catherine walked in without asking anyone for permission, it all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. She wasn't a stranger there. Catherine walked up the expansive driveway. Perfectly manicured hedges lined both sides. In the center courtyard, an infinity fountain cascaded, the water catching the golden hour light. A middle-aged housekeeper hurried out of the grand double doors, practically running to meet her. Miss Sterling, you've returned without any notice. Let me ready your suite immediately. Catherine smiled faintly. No need to panic, Helen. I've just come home to live. The phrase was simple, but it carried a monumental shift in meaning. To live meant she wasn't visiting, wasn't staying temporarily. She was back for good. Helen paused for a fraction of a second, then nodded quickly. Understood, ma'am. She turned to the staff hovering behind her. Get the master suite ready for Miss Lake A. Tal 2-2. Sterling immediately. Catherine pulled her suitcase toward the marble steps. Before walking through the front doors, she stopped and turned her head to look back across the street. Her eyes locked with Derek's. The distance between the two mansions wasn't far, but in that moment, they felt like two entirely different universes. Derek crossed the street with rapid, heavy strides. Nancy scrambled after him. Catherine! He called out. His voice had completely lost its arrogant composure. Catherine stood motionless, waiting for him to approach the property line. What are you doing here? Derek demanded, the words tumbling out. Catherine looked at him with an expression of absolute frost. You have eyes. Why ask? Whose house is this? He pressed, as if aggressively denying his own creeping realization. Catherine tilted her head slightly. The corners of her lips curved up. It wasn't a mocking smile, nor was it a kind one. Mine. The word dropped light as a feather, heavy as a tombstone. Nancy reacted instantly, her voice shrill. What kind of nonsense is this? Your house? Have you lost your mind? Catherine didn't even look at her. She spoke with slow, measured precision. The deed is in my name. If you require proof, Nancy, I can have my staff bring out a copy for you to inspect. Her voice wasn't loud or harsh, but every syllable rang with undeniable authority. Derek took a half step back. It suddenly dawned on him that in 3 years of marriage, he had never seriously inquired about Catherine's family background. He only knew she lived simply, never flaunted wealth, and rarely spoke of relatives. He had always assumed she was a nobody from an average background. But now, an estate worth tens of millions of dollars, sitting directly across from his own, belonged to her. That's impossible. he muttered. Catherine stared at him for another second. I simply moved back into my own home, she said quietly. The phrase sounded so effortless, as if this mind-bending reality was the most mundane thing in the world. But to Derek, it was a brutal strike to his ego. For 3 years, he had fancied himself her savior, the man who gave her a life, a roof over her head, status, and a family. It turned out he was the one living an illusion. Nancy still refused to accept it. Stop making things up. If you're so filthy rich, why did you put up with being treated like garbage in my house all these years? Catherine turned and, for the first time, looked her former mother-in-law dead in the eye. Her gaze was completely devoid of its former submissiveness, because I believed that if I offered genuine sincerity, it would be met with the same. She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. But evidently, I was wrong. The silence became suffocating. A gust of wind rustled the giant oaks in the courtyard. Catherine turned away, rolled her suitcase, and walked into the house. The colossal double doors shut firmly behind her. Outside, Derek stood like a man struck by lightning. For the first time in years, he felt a crushing sensation in his chest. The realization that he had just lost something irreplaceable, something he would never, ever get back. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind Catherine Sterling. Inside, the grand foyer was so quiet you could hear her light footsteps echoing off the imported Italian marble. The familiar, faint scent of bespoke essential oils made her pause for a moment. 3 years. She hadn't stepped foot in this place for 3 years. Helen, the housekeeper, stood respectfully behind her. Your suite has remained exactly as you left it, Miss Sterling. We've had it professionally cleaned every week. Catherine nodded slightly. Thank you for your hard work, Helen. Please, ma'am. Mr. Sterling gave strict orders that this place was to be kept ready for you at all times, even if you never visited. At the mention of Mr. Sterling, Catherine's eyes flickered. Michael Sterling, her grandfather. One of the most reclusive, yet ruthlessly powerful titans of West Coast commercial real estate. Catherine rolled her suitcase toward the grand sweeping staircase. With every step she took, fragments of the past dragged behind her. She pushed open the double doors to the master suite. It was the same familiar sanctuary, the massive canopy bed facing the floor-to-ceiling windows, the walnut vanity, the custom bookshelves in the corner. Nothing had changed. The only thing that had changed was the woman standing inside it. Catherine left the suitcase by the door, sat on the edge of the mattress, laced her fingers together, squeezed tightly, and then let go. A long exhale escaped her lips, and the memories flooded in. That year, Catherine was 25. She wasn't your typical Bay Area socialite or spoiled heiress. Despite being the sole granddaughter of Michael Sterling, she chose to live completely independently. She worked at a major media conglomerate in downtown San Francisco, drove a standard Honda to work, and dressed in understated brands. Nobody at the office knew her true pedigree. And that was exactly where she met Derek Vance. It was pouring rain that afternoon. Catherine was standing under the awning of a parking garage, trying to get her car to start. A stranger walked up to her. "Car trouble?" he asked. She was a bit flustered. "I think the battery's dead." He didn't ask any unnecessary questions. He simply popped the hood and went to work. The rain soaked through his dress shirt, clinging to his shoulders, but he was patient and focused. Soon, the engine roared to life. Before Catherine could even properly thank him, he was already smiling. All set. Next time, give it a check before a long drive. That smile had been genuine and warm. After that chance encounter, they started talking. Derek was just an ambitious structural engineer back then, dreaming of launching his own tech-integrated construction firm. He had no wealth, no connections, nothing but grit and ambition. But he had a relentless drive that touched Catherine's heart. A year later, they were married. The day Catherine told her grandfather she wanted to marry Derek, Michael Sterling sat in a long, heavy silence. "Are you absolutely certain?" he asked. Catherine nodded, her eyes resolute. "I don't need him to be a billionaire, Grandpa. I just need him to be genuine." Her grandfather sighed. "If you've made your choice, I won't stand in your way. But remember this, Kate. Never let yourself reach the point of regret." Catherine believed she never would. The early days of the marriage were brutal. Derek launched his startup without capital or industry backing. They had to scrape by. On her own initiative, Catherine quit her lucrative media job. Derek had protested, You don't have to do this. She just smiled softly. I'm your wife. If I don't fight for our future with you, who will? From that day on, she stood silently as his shadow. By day, she met with gritty suppliers to negotiate the best material costs. By night, she sat with him until 3 a.m., balancing the company's chaotic ledgers. Once, when the company was desperately short on operating cash, Catherine quietly took her late mother's vintage Tiffany diamonds to a high-end broker in the city. When Derek found out, he held her fiercely, his voice breaking. I swear to you, Kate, I will make this up to you one day. Back then, she believed this man would rather die than betray her. But reality rarely honors old promises. As the company scaled, the money and reputation rolled in, and Derek began to change. The late nights at the office became more frequent. Secretive phone calls. Suspiciously long business trips to LA and New York. Catherine didn't interrogate him not because she was blind, but because she saw things all too clearly. One night, while Derek was in the shower, his iPhone lit up on the nightstand. Are you asleep yet? I miss you. The sender's name. Valerie. Catherine stared at the glowing screen for a long time. She didn't shake. She didn't break down crying. She simply burned that name into her memory. From that day on, she began her own quiet investigation. She threw no tantrums, made no scenes, displayed no jealousy. Like a ghost, she collected the pieces. Geotagged photos, hidden transaction histories, unexplained wire transfers, vendor contracts layered with kickbacks. She even discovered that Valerie wasn't just a homewrecker, she was the mastermind behind several of Derek's most legally dubious corporate decisions. But Catherine remained silent, not out of weakness, but because she was waiting for the board to be perfectly set. And now, Catherine stood up and unzipped her suitcase. She pulled out the small wooden lockbox and popped the lid. Inside lay a meticulously organized stack of documents. Every page was a shard of the truth. Every piece of evidence was a step toward annihilation. She ran her index finger along the edge of the top file, her eyes darkening. Helen knocked softly on the open door. Miss Sterling, shall I have the chef prepare dinner? Catherine closed the box. No, Helen. Tonight, I just want to sit in the quiet. Of course, ma'am. Helen retreated silently. Catherine stepped out onto the sprawling master balcony. From here, she had a perfect, unobstructed view of the mansion across the street, the house she had just been thrown out of. The lights in the living room were still blazing. Derek's silhouette paced past the window. She watched the glow for a long time before letting out a soft exhale. Her voice was a whisper meant only for the night air. 3 years was more than enough. The California breeze caught her hair. The look in Catherine's eyes no longer belonged to a submissive, supportive wife. It was the look of a grandmaster sitting down at a chessboard, a game she fully intended to win. Night fell over San Francisco. The city lights glittered across the bay. The Ritz-Carlton was ablaze with the glow of 100 crystal chandeliers. One after another, sleek black town cars and European sports cars pulled up to the valet. Elegantly dressed guests stepped out, radiating the distinct aura of Silicon Valley wealth and cutthroat ambition. Tonight was the official signing gala between Derek's firm, Apex Construction, and a syndicate of major developers. On the surface, it was a celebration. In reality, it was an arena for flexing status in the corporate food chain. Derek stepped out of his Mercedes, adjusting his bespoke cuffs. Beside him was Valerie Pierce. She wore a skin-tight, wine-red evening gown. Her hair fell in perfect cascading waves, her makeup flawless and sharp. Her eyes sparkled with the deliberate intent of drawing every gaze in the room. Valerie slipped her arm intimately through Derek's, her voice a soft purr. Derek, are you sure it's okay that I came with you as your plus one? Derek glanced at her, a confident smirk playing on his lips. You're my executive assistant. There's nothing strange about it. He paused, dropping his voice to a low, intimate register. Besides, you don't need to hide from anyone anymore. The words made Valerie beam. Pure, unadulterated triumph flashed in her eyes. They entered the grand ballroom, and a swarm of industry partners immediately flocked to them. A middle-aged developer let out a booming laugh. Derek, my man, you've been crushing it lately. Derek shook his hand with practiced ease. Only because of your backing, Richard. The developer's eyes slid to Valerie, scanning her appreciatively. And who might this vision be? Without a second thought, Derek placed his hand on the small of Valerie's back and pulled her flush against him. My most crucial asset. The air around them shifted slightly. Knowing glances and slick smiles were exchanged among the men. Valerie cast her eyes down in feigned modesty. Oh, stop, I'm just his assistant. But her hand, gripping Derek's bicep, never let go. In a darker corner of the room, a cluster of executives' wives whispered behind their champagne flutes. I heard Vance just finalized his divorce. Yeah. His ex-wife was a total wallflower. Couldn't keep him interested. Well, if the wife is too boring, someone else is always ready to step in. A low, sarcastic chuckle rippled through the group. Just then, the massive mahogany doors to the ballroom swung open. The maitre d' stepped forward and announced with crisp formality, "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests." Every head in the room swiveled toward the entrance. Catherine appeared. She wore an ivory silk gown minimalist in design, but screaming of old money and untouchable elegance. Her hair was worn loose, her makeup natural but striking. Her aura was utterly calm, yet it radiated such sheer, intimidating dignity that the entire room fell dead silent. The event's VIP coordinator practically sprinted over to her, bowing slightly. "Miss Sterling, right this way to the VIP lounge. The senior partners are eagerly awaiting you." Catherine gave a microscopic nod. "Thank you." Her voice was soft but cut through the quiet room. The whispers ignited like wildfire. "Who is she? She looks familiar. Wait, isn't that Derek Vance's ex-wife?" Across the ballroom, Derek had already spotted her. He froze, his champagne glass hovering midair, completely unable to tear his eyes away. Valerie recognized her too, but quickly plastered on a mask of composure. She dug her acrylic nails slightly into Derek's arm and whispered urgently, "Derek, she's here." Derek's jaw locked. His voice dropped to sub-zero. "Ignore her." But his eyes remained glued to Catherine. Escorted by the coordinator, Catherine glided across the floor, parting the crowd like the Red Sea. As she approached the space where Derek and Valerie stood, she naturally slowed. The air around them pulled taut, like a violin string about to snap. Valerie made the first move. Her voice was drenched in syrupy condescension. "Catherine, if you're feeling out of place or uncomfortable tonight, I truly apologize." Catherine looked at her with an absolute, unwavering calm. "You don't need to apologize to me." She let the silence stretch for a beat, her tone flat and lethal. "The person you should be apologizing to isn't me." Valerie bit her lip, pivoting flawlessly into the role of the bullied victim. "I never meant to ruin anything for anyone." Derek instantly stepped in front of Valerie, physically shielding her. "Catherine, that is enough," he snapped, glaring at her as if she were a rabid stranger. "This isn't the place for your petty scenes." Catherine tilted her head, her expression unbothered. "Am I making a scene?" She let out a soft, chilling laugh. "I'm literally just standing here." Derek's fists clenched. "You don't belong to me anymore. Don't you dare try to sabotage my business." The way he spat the words drew a brutal, absolute boundary. Catherine remained silent for a second, then nodded. "You're right." She took a step back. "We have absolutely nothing to do with each other." With that, she turned on her heel, and the staff whisked her away toward the frosted glass VIP enclave. Behind her, wide eyes followed her every move. Why is she getting VIP treatment? I think the top-tier equity partners personally invited her. Something serious is going on here. Valerie stared after her, her grip on Derek's arm tightening painfully. A cold dread was beginning to coil in her stomach. Derek stood paralyzed. For the absolute first time, he felt a terrifying sensation. Catherine had slipped entirely out of his control. The gala buzzed on. The string quartet played, the clinking of glasses and networking chatter resumed, but in the shadows, tectonic plates were shifting. And this night was merely the prelude. The VIP lounge at the Ritz-Carlton was separated from the main ballroom by soundproof, frosted glass panels. Inside, the noise of the party faded to a hum. The lighting was moody and expensive, the service discreet. Everyone inside this enclosure was a heavy-hitting equity partner, a venture capitalist, or a board member. And sitting right in the center of the plush leather banquette was Catherine. Opposite her sat two silver-haired men in bespoke suits, leaning in to discuss a portfolio. One of them spoke with deep reverence. "Miss Sterling, our syndicate is exceptionally impressed with your restructuring proposal. Assuming no red flags, we're prepared to sign the term sheets by Tuesday." Catherine gave a slight, affirming nod. "I look forward to a long-term partnership, Richard. The key is that both sides honor their commitments." Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a gravity that commanded absolute attention. Outside the glass, eyes were still locked on her. Her presence in the inner sanctum had the ballroom buzzing with rumors. Who exactly is she? Look at how the partners are treating her. She's definitely not a nobody. But wasn't she just standing over there with Vance? In the main hall, Valerie stood next to Derek, but her eyes kept darting nervously toward the frosted glass. She bit her lower lip and murmured, "Derek, something isn't right. There's more to her than we thought." Derek didn't respond immediately. He lifted his bourbon, took a slow pull, his eyes dark and brooding. "Whoever she is now, it doesn't concern us." Valerie nodded, but a toxic cocktail of insecurity and rage was brewing inside her. She hated the way everyone was looking at Catherine, and she loathed the fact that Derek's gaze subconsciously kept drifting back to the glass. A calculating thought flashed through her mind. She put on a bright smile and tugged at his sleeve. "Derek, let's go over there and say hello to the partners." Derek hesitated for a fraction of a second, then gave a stiff nod. They navigated through the crowd toward the VIP entrance. Inside the lounge, a conversation had just wrapped up. Catherine stood up, preparing to mingle with another table, when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Excuse me, do you mind if we join you for a moment?" Derek asked. His tone was professional, polished. Catherine turned around. Their eyes met. Zero emotion, just miles of cold distance. One of the senior partners recognized Derek and smiled cordially. "Ah, Derek. Glad to see you in here." Derek nodded smoothly. "I'm here for the gala, but I know Project Zenith is the talk of the town right now. I was hoping to get some FaceTime and learn a bit more." As he spoke, he cut his eyes toward Catherine, silently trying to probe her status. Valerie, hovering at his side, offered a saccharine smile. "I'd love to learn from all of your expertise as well." Saying this, she took a deliberate step forward, positioning herself directly in Catherine's personal space. The distance between them was less than 2 feet. Valerie dropped her voice to a whisper, meant only for Catherine and those immediately around them. "Kate, I really think you need to remember your place." The atmosphere instantly turned to ice. Conversations at the nearby tables halted as heads turned. Catherine didn't flinch. She simply looked at Valerie with a gaze so terrifyingly calm it was unreadable. Valerie pushed further, her voice dripping with venom masquerading as advice. "Rooms like this aren't for everyone. You'd be much better off finding a circle that actually suits you." The second the words left her mouth, Derek frowned slightly, but he didn't stop her. In his mind, the script was written. Catherine would back down in humiliation, just as she always did. But this time, Catherine stepped forward, closing the gap until they were practically chest to chest. Her eyes never left Valerie's. And then, a sharp, ringing slap echoed through the room. The sound wasn't deafening, but in the hushed VIP lounge, it was as loud as a gunshot. Valerie stood petrified, her face violently jerked to the side. A bright red handprint was already blossoming across her cheek. The entire lounge froze. No one even twitched. Catherine slowly lowered her hand. Her voice was flat, perfectly level, without a tremor of adrenaline. "I don't make a habit of talking much." She stared dead into Valerie's shocked eyes. "But that does not mean any cheap opportunist can walk up and speak to me however they please." Valerie clutched her burning cheek, her eyes welling with furious, humiliated tears. You hit me," she stammered, her voice shaking. Catherine stood tall, her posture regal. Her gaze dropped several degrees colder. "If I yield, it doesn't mean I've lost." The sentence landed like a judge's gavel, sharp, final, and absolute. It wasn't a defense. It was a manifesto. Derek snapped out of his shock, lunging forward with a furious bark. "Catherine, what the hell are you doing?" He glared at her with a volatile mix of rage and total bewilderment. Catherine slowly shifted her eyes to him. Exactly what needs to be done. Derek's hands balled into fists. You think this is the kind of place where you can just throw a tantrum? Catherine tilted her head. And you think this is the kind of place where your mistress can insult me, and I'm supposed to swallow it? The question hit Derek like a physical blow, leaving him completely speechless. Whispers erupted around them. Who does she think she is? Slapping a woman in the middle of a billionaire's gala? But the senior partners didn't call security. They didn't even look offended. One of the men standing nearby leaned over to a colleague and muttered, "She's the lead representative for the Zenith investors. The fate of this entire development rests on her." The whisper was quiet, but it traveled at the speed of light. The stares directed at Catherine mutated in real time. The curiosity vanished, replaced entirely by deep, cautious respect. Valerie stood there, burning with humiliation and rage, but she didn't dare utter another syllable. Because for the first time in her life, she felt a suffocating, crushing pressure. She was entirely out of her depth. Catherine didn't spare Valerie another glance. She pivoted back to the senior partners, her voice returning to its smooth, professional cadence. "I apologize for the interruption, gentlemen. Shall we resume?" The partner immediately nodded, clearing his throat. "Of course, Miss Sterling." The business talk resumed, but the gravity in the room had fundamentally shifted. Derek stood on the periphery, watching the scene. For the very first time, it brutally clicked in his brain. The quiet woman who used to stand in his shadow had ascended to a throne he could no longer control, and to a height he might never be allowed to touch again. The gala at the Ritz wrapped up just as the clock struck 10. Catherine Sterling walked out of the ballroom under the cautious, calculating stares of the Silicon Valley elite. No one dared look at her as the weak, discarded ex-wife they had assumed she was at the start of the night. She stepped out into the crisp San Francisco night air. Her black Maybach was already idling at the curb. The chauffeur opened the rear door and gave a slight bow. "Heading home, Miss Sterling?" "Yes, home," she replied softly. The luxury sedan pulled away from the curb, leaving the glittering chaos of downtown behind. In the back seat, Catherine leaned her head against the headrest, watching the city lights blur past the tinted windows. The alternating light and shadows painted sharp contours on her face. Her hand rested lightly on her designer handbag, which contained the lockbox of every piece of damning evidence she had quietly hoarded over the years. Tonight, she hadn't just made an entrance. She had officially moved her first pawn. The Maybach rolled through the gates of her Atherton estate and glided to a stop. The courtyard was bathed in soft landscape lighting. Catherine stepped out of the car and said to her driver, "You can clock out for the night. Come a little earlier tomorrow morning." "Understood, Miss Sterling," the driver replied, pulling away. Catherine pulled her trench coat tighter around her shoulders and began walking toward the grand entrance. But after taking only a few steps, she suddenly stopped. "Catherine," a man's voice drifted over from the property line. It was deep, articulate, and utterly unhurried. Catherine turned around. Standing under the warm glow of a street lamp, right on the border of the neighboring estate, was a man. He wore a dark, tailored dress shirt with the sleeves casually rolled up to the forearms. He was tall, his posture commanding, his gaze impossibly steady. The distance was short enough to clearly make out his sharp features. Catherine narrowed her eyes slightly. She didn't place him immediately, but an old familiarity sparked in her brain. The man took a few steps closer to the gate and spoke with cool confidence. "I don't believe we need to introduce ourselves again." Catherine studied him for a heartbeat, then spoke softly. "You're..." The man offered a faint, razor-thin smile. "Alex Mercer." The moment the name dropped, Catherine's eyes shifted. She didn't remember him just because his name was plastered across the Wall Street Journal as a titan of commercial real estate. She remembered him from a very old memory. Years ago, at one of her grandfather's ultra-exclusive closed-door board meetings, a young man had sat quietly at the far corner of the table. He rarely spoke, but every time he did, even the most cutthroat veterans in the room shut up and took notes. That man was Alex Mercer. Catherine gave a slow nod. "I remember." Alex looked at her, his eyes dark and perceptive. "So do I." He paused, letting the silence hang before adding, "But I imagine you didn't expect us to run into each other under these specific circumstances." Catherine didn't bother denying it. "I also didn't expect you to be my neighbor." Alex let out a low chuckle. "I bought this place a little over a year ago. It's just that the owner of the house across the street was famously absent. He locked eyes with her. Turns out it was you. A simple phrase, but it carried a heavy confirmation. He hadn't just figured out who she was tonight. Catherine didn't act surprised. She cut straight to the chase. When did you connect the dots? Alex didn't dodge the question. The moment you stepped into the VIP lounge tonight, his tone was matter-of-fact. An Apex investor representative with the last name Sterling, carrying herself with that kind of lethal composure. The math wasn't hard. Catherine's gaze sharpened into a blade. Have you been having me followed? Alex shook his head slowly. No. I only pay attention to people who are worth my time. It was a blunt answer, devoid of any backpedaling or flattery. Just a cold, hard fact. A charged silence stretched between them for a few seconds. The California wind rustled the heavy oak branches above. Alex broke the quiet. For what it's worth, I thought you handled the situation in the lounge flawlessly. Catherine arched a brow. You mean the slap? Yes, he replied simply. Not everyone has the ice in their veins to pull that off. Catherine didn't reply. She turned around, intending to head inside. But Alex's voice stopped her again. Catherine. She paused. I have a proposition for you. She looked back over her shoulder, her expression guarded. I'm listening. Alex took one step forward, maintaining a respectful but deliberate proximity. Project Zenith. I assume you know the scope of the development. Catherine gave a terse nod. I hold the controlling equity, Alex continued smoothly. But I need a partner on the ground, someone who can manage the optics, the PR bloodbaths, and trace the hidden financial pipelines. He looked right through her. I think you're the perfect fit. Catherine didn't rush her answer. She studied him, evaluating the angle. Are you short on executives? She asked. Alex shook his head slightly. I have plenty of executives, he said, his voice dropping an octave. I just don't trust them. Those words instantly altered the atmosphere, shifting the conversation from a pure business transaction into a high-stakes psychological game. Catherine offered a faint, knowing smile. And you trust me? Alex held her gaze, unwavering. I trust a woman who has the discipline to hide her true identity for 3 years, just to test a man's character. He paused, the timbre of his voice heavy, and who has the sheer ruthlessness to burn it all down the second she realizes he failed. Catherine said nothing. For the first time in her life, someone was looking directly into her core, deciphering her exact motives without demanding a single apology or explanation. She broke eye contact, looking toward her front door, and whispered, I'll think about it. Alex didn't push. I'll be waiting for your call. Catherine walked inside. The heavy doors boomed shut. Outside, Alex remained on the pavement. He looked up at the master suite windows as the lights flicked on. The corners of his mouth twitched upward, a very rare display of genuine intrigue. Inside, Catherine leaned her back against the heavy mahogany door. Her eyes darkened with fierce calculation. A new game had just begun on the board, and this time, she wasn't playing alone. The next morning, inside the sleek, glass-walled offices of Apex Construction, the atmosphere in the executive conference room was suffocatingly tense. Every department head was seated around the table, but no one dared to breathe, let alone speak. Derek Vance sat at the head of the table, his elbows resting on the glass surface, fingers tapping a nervous, erratic rhythm. On the massive LED screen at the front of the room, the Q3 financial report glowed menacingly. The red ink and negative projections were glaring. He swept his eyes over his team, his voice a low growl. Who is going to explain this to me? The CFO swallowed hard and stood up. Derek, 2 of our Tier 1 contracts from last week were abruptly pulled by the developers. Reason? Derek snapped instantly. They didn't give anything concrete, just generic legal jargon about shifting strategic corporate alignment. Dead silence filled the room. Derek's fists clenched on the table. Those 2 contracts accounted for nearly 30% of their projected quarterly revenue. Without them, their cash flow would hemorrhage immediately. The head of procurement chimed in nervously. It gets worse. Our primary material suppliers just hiked their baseline prices by 15% across the board. All of them? At the same time? Derek's eyes narrowed into slits. Yes. It was practically synchronized. Derek leaned back in his leather ergonomic chair, his mind racing. That is not a coincidence. That is a coordinated hit. The glass door to the conference room opened. Valerie walked in, clutching an iPad and a stack of dossiers. She scanned the panicked room and quickly smoothed her features into her usual unflappable mask. "Apologies, I was handling a crisis call," she purred softly. Derek didn't reprimand her. He cut straight to the point. "Have you seen the Q3 projections?" Valerie nodded, walking to his side and placing the files on the table. "I have. The bleed is bad, Derek, but there is a lifeline." Half a dozen desperate pairs of eyes snapped toward her. Derek frowned. "Spit it out." Valerie kept her voice low, but crystal clear. "Project Zenith. They just opened the secondary bidding for prime contractors. If we can squeeze our way into that development, the margins alone will cover all our Q3 losses and then some." The CFO immediately balked. "Valerie, Zenith requires massive upfront capital bonding. We are severely over-leveraged right now, which is exactly why we need to aggressively outbid the competition," Valerie interrupted, her tone soft but slicing. She looked down at Derek. "If we bleed time over metrics, someone else is going to eat our lunch." Derek remained silent. Project Zenith was the crown jewel of Silicon Valley real estate right now, and the man holding the keys to the kingdom was Alex Mercer. He knew exactly who that was. He also knew that bidding on it right now was akin to playing Russian roulette with his company's remaining cash. "What do you want to do?" Valerie murmured, stepping closer. Derek stared at the table, conflict raging in his eyes. His brain wasn't just processing profit margins and burn rates, it was flashing back to the image of Catherine, standing aloof and untouchable in the VIP lounge last night. She was operating on a completely different stratosphere now. If he didn't make a massive power play, he would be left utterly in the dust. He slammed his fist on the table, the decision made. "Prep the pitch deck. We are going all in on Zenith." The CFO went pale. "Derek, I strongly advise against do it." Derek roared, shutting him down instantly. Nobody else dared to breathe a word of protest. Valerie offered a microscopic, fleeting smile. It vanished in an instant, but it betrayed her vicious, calculating satisfaction. At that exact moment, in the sprawling mansion across the street in Atherton, Catherine sat in her minimalist home office. In front of her, an array of Bloomberg terminals displayed real-time market data and private equity trackers. Helen, her housekeeper and confidant, stood quietly by the desk. "Miss Sterling, the pressure on Derek's firm is escalating rapidly," Helen reported in a hushed tone. Catherine wasn't the least bit surprised. 2 canceled contracts. "Everything is on schedule?" she asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Yes, ma'am. The partners pivoted to our subsidiaries exactly as you instructed." Catherine nodded, her eyes drifting to a separate chart. "And the material costs?" "Adjusted through the Sterling supply chain network. Apex no longer has access to wholesale pricing." Catherine closed her eyes for a brief second. Everything was flowing perfectly. No screaming matches, no direct confrontations, just a silent, invisible noose tightening around his neck, inch by inch. She opened her eyes, her voice serene. "What about Project Zenith?" "Mr. Mercer has officially opened the floor for contractor bids," Helen replied. Catherine let out a soft, dark chuckle. "Derek won't be able to resist taking the bait." Helen hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Are you going to allow his firm to participate?" Catherine leaned back in her high-backed leather chair, her gaze plunging into absolute darkness. "No," she said, drawing out the syllable slowly. "I'm just going to hold the door open and watch him walk right into the slaughterhouse." A quiet sentence, but terrifying in its implication. This was no longer a string of bad luck for Derek Vance. It was a meticulously orchestrated execution. Later that afternoon, Derek's office was a war zone. His phone rang incessantly. The notifications were a barrage of disaster. A major banking partner, Capital Trust, had just frozen their extended line of credit. Derek paced behind his desk, holding his phone to his ear, his temper fraying. "I am handling the liquidity issue. Just give me 48 hours to restructure." On the other end of the line, the bank executive's voice was devoid of empathy. "Derek, we need hard collateral, not promises. Your draw is frozen until further notice." Click. The line went dead. Derek hurled his iPhone across the desk. It clattered against the glass. What the hell is happening? Valerie hurried in, closing the door behind her. She walked up to him and placed a soothing hand on his shoulder. Derek, breathe. In moments like this, you have to stay surgical. She leaned in close, her voice a hypnotic whisper. Trust me. The second we lock in Project Zenith, the banks will be begging to open those lines of credit again. Derek didn't respond, but his jaw clenched so hard a muscle ticked in his cheek. He had absolutely no idea that every single frantic step he was taking had been plotted out by someone else days ago. As night blanketed the Bay Area, Catherine stood on her private balcony, a glass of expensive Cabernet in her hand. She stared at the modern estate across the street. The lights in Derek's office were glaringly bright. She knew he wasn't sleeping. She knew he was pacing, sweating, desperately clawing for an exit strategy. She took a slow sip of wine, her voice barely a whisper in the dark. You really thought I was nothing but collateral damage, didn't you? The coastal wind whipped her hair across her face. Her eyes were colder than the Pacific. Then keep believing it. The opening gambit was over. And this time, he didn't even know he was playing the game. 3 days later, the executive boardroom on the top floor of the Zenith Investment Syndicate Tower in downtown San Francisco. It was a stark, intimidating room wrapped entirely in floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a dizzying, panoramic view of the fog rolling over the Golden Gate Bridge. Representatives from the most elite construction firms in the state had arrived early. Thick, glossy pitch decks sat perfectly aligned in front of them. The tension in the room was palpable, masked only by tailored suits and tight, nervous smiles. This wasn't just a closed-door bidding war, it was a king-making event. Derek walked into the boardroom, flanked by Valerie and 2 junior analysts. He wore a sharp charcoal suit, his stride radiating an arrogant confidence he didn't actually feel. Valerie leaned in close, whispering into his ear. I triple-checked the financials. The bid is flawless. Derek gave a curt nod. We cannot afford to lose this one. He scanned the long mahogany table. There were heavy hitters in the room, firms with double his market cap. But Derek maintained his smug exterior because he had spent a small fortune bribing consultants and greasing palms to smooth his path. Several lower-tier committee members had already given him backdoor assurances. In Derek's mind, the fix was in. In the far corner, 2 rival executives muttered to each other behind their hands. I heard Vance's firm is drowning in a cash flow crisis. What are they even doing here? They must be throwing a Hail Mary. But I'm telling you, the Zenith Money guys are absolutely ruthless. The heavy double doors to the boardroom remained shut. Finally, an executive secretary stepped out and announced with crisp authority, Representatives, please take your seats. The board will be in session momentarily. The room scrambled to find their designated leather chairs. Derek sat near the center, resting his forearms on the table, projecting an alpha calm. Valerie, seated slightly behind him in the gallery row, whispered, Don't sweat it. We have this locked. Derek nodded. He believed her. At least for the next 60 seconds. The main doors swung open. A phalanx of suits walked in, led by Alex Mercer. Alex wore a midnight blue bespoke suit, his steps measured, exuding the kind of terrifying power that only billions of dollars can buy. His dark eyes swept the room, pausing for a fraction of a microsecond on Derek, before moving on. Derek stiffened slightly. He knew this man was the apex predator of the project, the final boss he had to impress. Alex took the center seat at the head of the table. The other board members filed into their respective chairs, but the plush leather seat immediately to Alex's right remained conspicuously empty. The void drew curious glances. Derek frowned slightly, leaning back to whisper to Valerie. Is someone missing? Valerie shook her head, looking confused. Not according to the docket. 1 second. 2 seconds. The air in the boardroom grew agonizingly thick. And then, the doors opened one last time. The sharp, rhythmic click of stilettos echoed against the hardwood floor. Catherine walked in. She wore a pristine, tailored white power suit, her hair slicked back into a severe, elegant knot, her makeup flawless and sharp. There was zero ostentation, zero flashiness, but her sheer, magnetic authority sucked all the oxygen out of the room. Every single head snapped toward her. Derek shot out of his chair, nearly knocking it over. Kate? What? The word exploded out of him before he could choke it back. The room was dead silent, but a shockwave of bewilderment rippled through the executives. Catherine didn't even look at him. She didn't flinch. She walked straight to the head of the table. Alex offered her a microscopic, respectful nod. "You made it," his voice rumbled quietly. Catherine returned the nod, pulled out the empty chair next to him, and sat down. This wasn't a guest chair. This was the throne of a decision-maker. The atmosphere flash froze. The senior board director cleared his throat and addressed the room with solemn formality. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce Catherine Sterling. She is the lead proxy representing the primary capital investors for Project Zenith." The sentence detonated in Derek's brain like a hand grenade. He stood frozen, a high-pitched ringing echoing in his ears. "This is impossible," he muttered under his breath. Behind him, Valerie had turned the color of chalk. She stared at Catherine, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror, refusing to believe her own retinas. Catherine sat with perfect posture. She flipped open the leather-bound dossier in front of her and spoke with a voice like shattering ice. "Let's begin." Not a single hesitation. Not a single stray glance at her ex-husband. It was as if Derek Vance was nothing more than an insect on her windshield. The presentations commenced. One by one, the CEOs stood up to pitch their proposals. Finally, it was Derek's turn. He walked to the front of the room, clutching his iPad, but his knuckles were white, and his fingers were trembling imperceptibly. He stared directly at Catherine. I am presenting the architectural and financial roadmap for Apex," he started, fighting violently to keep his voice steady. He launched into his pitch. The metrics were sharp, the logistics were mapped out. Valerie had ensured it was a masterful presentation, but Catherine's expression remained carved from marble. She casually flipped through his printed deck, occasionally jotting down a note with a gold pen. When he finally finished, panting slightly, Catherine looked up. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice perfectly even. "Where exactly is your contingency capital sourced from?" Derek stumbled over the words for a split second. "We have secured backing from our banking partners and a syndicate of strategic equity investors." Catherine gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Which bank?" "Specifically, Capital Trust Bank." Catherine locked eyes with him, and the temperature in the room plummeted. "According to my intelligence, your line of credit with Capital Trust was suspended indefinitely as of yesterday afternoon." The air was sucked out of the boardroom, executives murmured, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Derek's jaw clenched in panic. "That is merely a temporary administrative hold." Catherine didn't let him finish. She didn't argue. She simply executed him. "This project is a multi-billion-dollar endeavor. We do not absorb the liquidity risks of unstable, insolvent contractors." A single, devastating sentence that incinerated weeks of his desperate plotting. Derek stared at her, his facade of professionalism completely disintegrating. "Kate," he blurted out, stepping forward. Catherine raised a single, perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Excuse me?" she said, her tone radioactive. "In this boardroom, you will address me by my proper title, Mr. Vance." The entire room held its breath. Derek stood paralyzed at the front of the room, feeling the physical sensation of being violently shoved out of a world he desperately needed to be in. The woman sitting across from him was no longer the quiet shadow who balanced his checkbooks late at night. She was the executioner deciding if he lived or died. The meeting dragged on, but for Derek, the war was already lost. When a 15-minute recess was called, Derek practically sprinted out into the glass-lined corridor. Valerie chased after him, her heels clicking frantically. "Derek! Did you know about this?" she hissed, her voice shrill with panic. He whipped around, grabbing her by the arm, his voice a lethal whisper. "You told me you ran the background intelligence. How the hell did you miss the fact that my ex-wife controls the capital?" Valerie shook her head violently, her eyes darting. "I had no idea. I swear to God." Derek stared at her for 3 agonizing seconds, his face twisted in disgust, before violently releasing her arm and turning away. Down the far end of the corridor, Catherine stood alone by the floor-to-ceiling glass window. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip, casting a golden halo around her sharp silhouette. She was looking out over the San Francisco skyline, her back to him, but her voice drifted down the hallway, quiet but piercing. "You're not used to standing on that side of the table, are you, Derek?" Derek froze. He couldn't speak. Catherine slowly turned her head, looking at him over her shoulder. Her gaze was terrifyingly serene. "You're going to have to get used to it." With that, she turned back and walked toward the executive suites, leaving him stranded in the hallway. For the very first time, Derek Vance tasted the bitter, suffocating reality of having his entire existence dictated by someone else's whim. The next morning, the gated streets of Atherton were as peaceful as ever. But the moment Derek turned on his iPad, it was obvious a digital earthquake was tearing through Silicon Valley. The top headline on a premier tech and finance blog screamed, "Mystery proxy of Zenith megaproject revealed, Michael Sterling's hidden heiress officially takes the helm." Right below the bold font was a high-resolution photo taken inside the Zenith boardroom yesterday. Catherine Sterling sat shoulder to shoulder with billionaire Alex Mercer. She looked poised, lethal, and untouchable. It was just one photograph, but it sent shockwaves through the entire West Coast real estate sector. In the living room of Derek's mansion, Nancy sat on the designer sofa, clutching her iPhone. Her eyes were bugging out of her skull as she read the article over and over again. "Oh my God, what is this?" Her voice trembled, cracking an octave high. Derek walked down the glass staircase, rubbing his temples. Seeing his mother looking like she had seen a ghost, he snapped, "Mom, what the hell are you staring at?" Nancy didn't answer. She just shakily extended her phone toward him. "Look, just look at it." Derek snatched the phone. His eyes scanned the first paragraph, then locked onto the photograph. His fingers gripped the edges of the device until his knuckles turned white. His face turned to stone with every passing second. "This is impossible," he rasped. But this time, it wasn't a denial of facts. It was a desperate, agonizing refusal to accept reality. Catherine. The granddaughter of Michael Sterling. The man whose name Derek had only heard whispered with reverence at elite industry summits. A titan who orchestrated skyline-altering developments. Derek stood paralyzed, his brain short-circuiting. Memories flooded his mind like a high-speed reel. The day Catherine casually said she was quitting her media job to do his bookkeeping. The day she quietly handed him the cash from selling her vintage Tiffany diamonds without a single complaint. The nights she sat in silence when he came home smelling like cheap perfume, never asking questions. Suddenly, everything slammed into a brutal, terrifying context. She hadn't stayed quiet because she was trapped, broke, and dependent. She stayed quiet because she never needed a damn thing from him in the first place. Nancy abruptly shot up from the sofa. "Derek, you need to go over there. Right now." Derek scowled, staring at his mother in disbelief. "Go over there for what?" "To talk to her. What else?" She stammered frantically, pacing the rug. She's family, for God's sake." Derek let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Family?" Nancy flinched but pushed forward, desperation making her manic. "At the end of the day, she was your wife. Maybe the divorce settlement can be renegotiated. Maybe we can void it." Her tone had completely morphed. Gone was the venomous arrogance. Now it was just naked, pathetic greed and terror. Derek stared at his mother, his eyes turning to ice. "Mom, did you conveniently forget what you called her when she signed the papers?" Nancy looked flustered. "Well, I didn't know back then, but now we do. And you think you can just hit rewind?" Derek barked. His voice wasn't a scream, but the venom in it forced Nancy's mouth shut. A heavy, suffocating silence blanketed the living room. Meanwhile, across the bay in the Apex construction offices, Valerie stood in her glass-walled office, clutching her phone. All the blood had drained from her face. She had read the same article. She had stared at the same photograph. "There's no way," she muttered, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into her palms. Outside her door, two analysts were whispering by the water cooler. Turns out Catherine Sterling is royalty. No wonder she walked out of here without asking for a dime. She was probably laughing at us. The gossip drifted through the glass into Valerie's ears. She gripped her phone tighter. A singular, terrifying thought beat against her skull. If Catherine truly wielded that kind of nuclear power, everything Valerie had clawed, schemed, and slept her way to get could be wiped out with a snap of Catherine's fingers. The office door swung open. Derek walked in. Valerie spun around, her voice betraying a slight tremor. "Derek," he didn't look at her. He walked straight to her desk and dropped his iPad onto the surface. The screen displayed the article. The atmosphere in the office instantly turned toxic. Valerie stepped closer, forcing her voice into a soothing, concerned register. "I saw the Bloomberg alert this morning." Derek said nothing. He stood completely still, his hands braced on the edge of the desk, staring a hole through the wood. Finally, he spoke, his voice dangerously low. "Did you know anything about this?" Valerie violently shook her head. "I had absolutely no idea she had that kind of background." She spoke fast, terrified of the suspicion radiating from him. "If I had known, I never would have," she choked on the rest of the sentence. Derek slowly turned his head to look at her. The look in his eyes sent a spike of pure dread down Valerie's spine. There was no affection left in his stare. No trust. Only a cold, clinical dissection. Valerie panicked, stepping forward and grabbing his hand. "Derek, no matter what happens, I'm still here. I'm in your corner." Her voice softened into a desperate plea. "I don't care who she is or what she has. I only care about you." Derek didn't pull his hand away, but he didn't squeeze back either. He stared down at her fingers wrapped around his. It felt wrong. The illusion had shattered. The only thing echoing in his brain right now wasn't Valerie's sweet lies, but the image of Catherine sitting in that boardroom poised, untouchable, utterly indifferent to his existence. He pulled his hand free and spoke in a flat monotone. "I need some space." Valerie froze. "Time for what?" Derek didn't answer. He turned his back on her and walked out of the office. The glass door clicked shut. Valerie stood alone in the center of the room, her eyes slowly turning cold and hollow. She knew she wasn't just losing her grip on the company, she was losing her grip on him. That afternoon, Catherine stood on her grand balcony in Atherton, looking down at the manicured rose gardens. Her phone screen lit up on the patio table. A text from an unsaved number. "We need to talk." She didn't need a caller ID to know who sent it. Catherine swiped the notification away without replying and set the phone face down. She looked out toward the horizon, watching the California wind whip through the trees. "This is just the prologue," she whispered to the wind. "This isn't revenge. It's consequence." Across the street, a man was drowning in regret. Another woman was spiraling in terror. And Catherine? She was just watching the board. Evening fell over Atherton. The warm, amber glow of the street lamps stretched the shadows of the oaks across the quiet, private avenues. Catherine stood near her front door, a glass of sparkling water in her hand, staring into the darkness toward the front gates. She had never answered Derek's text. She knew he wouldn't let it go easily. And exactly as she calculated, a sleek black SUV rolled to a stop by the curb, but not in front of her gates. It stopped near the property line separating her estate from Derek's. Alex Mercer stepped out of the back seat. He didn't walk toward the gates to buzz in. He simply stood on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, looking toward Catherine's silhouette on the porch. The distance between them was significant, but the contrast was stark. One was perfectly serene, the other was waiting. Alex spoke first, his deep voice carrying easily in the quiet night. "I assume you read my message." Catherine didn't deny it. "I read it. I didn't answer." "Because you don't have an answer yet." He finished for her, a faint smirk in his tone. He took a few steps closer, stopping just outside the wrought iron gate. "Then I'll just say it to your face." He locked eyes with her, skipping all the corporate pleasantries and high society games. "Catherine, be with me." No metaphors, no beating around the bush, just a direct, lethal strike. Catherine arched a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. She didn't look shocked, merely allowing a beat of silence to pass. "And in return, I'll help you take back every single thing they stole from you," Alex continued, never breaking eye contact. The air between them grew charged. A sudden gust of wind caught the hem of Catherine's dress. She set her glass down on a patio side table and walked slowly down the steps toward the gate. "Do you honestly think I need your help?" she asked. It wasn't a challenge. It was a genuine inquiry. Alex didn't blink. "You don't." His voice was low and hypnotic. "But with me, the demolition goes much faster." It was a ruthlessly calculating proposal. Not a traditional Silicon Valley romance, but a merger of power wrapped in a confession of desire. Catherine studied his face through the iron bars for a few seconds. Are you trying to weaponize your feelings to leverage a business transaction? Alex shook his head slightly. No. I'm offering you an arsenal. He paused, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. And you have every right to refuse it. His brutal honesty stripped away all the usual pretenses. No manipulation, no lies. Catherine turned her head, looking past him toward the mansion across the street. A heavy silence stretched out. She didn't answer, but she didn't walk away either. Alex didn't press her. He just stood there, waiting in the dark, and from across the street, Derek Vance was standing behind the sheer curtains of his living room. He had been watching since Alex pulled up. He saw the body language, the proximity, and he could guess the context of the conversation. Even though he couldn't hear a word, his gut screamed that this man was a predator, and Catherine was no longer playing by Derek's rules. Derek's fists balled up. A sickening wave of possessiveness and loss of control washed over him. He yanked his front door open and practically sprinted down his driveway to the street. Catherine! His voice shattered the quiet of the neighborhood. Catherine turned her head slowly. Alex merely shifted his gaze, eyeing Derek with absolute, terrifying boredom. Derek marched right up to the property line. He glared at Alex first, then snapped his eyes to Catherine. What are you doing out here with him? He demanded, his voice tight and aggressive. Catherine didn't flinch. She let him stew for a second before answering in a voice devoid of temperature. What I do is no longer any of your concern. The words hit Derek like a physical strike. He faltered, the aggressive facade cracking. Kate, he started, his voice dropping into a desperate plea, but he caught himself. Catherine's eyes turned to liquid nitrogen. I suggest you remember how to address me. A brutal silence fell. Alex finally spoke, his tone casual but laced with a lethal warning. Mr. Vance, this is private property. I'd advise you to respect the boundary line. Derek snapped his head toward him, bristling with hostility. Who the hell are you? Alex Mercer. A two-word answer delivered with the weight of an anvil. Hearing the name of the man holding the keys to his company's survival, Derek physically recoiled. He realized instantly that the man standing inches away was someone who could crush him like a bug. The atmosphere grew incredibly heavy. Catherine had no interest in dragging out the soap opera. If you have nothing productive to say, leave, she told Derek flatly. Derek stared at her. A flash of utter despair crossed his face, but ultimately, he had no ammunition left. He swallowed his pride, turned on his heel, and stalked back toward his house. His front door slammed shut. Silence reclaimed the street. Catherine looked back at Alex. Did you enjoy the show? She asked quietly. I saw what I needed to see, Alex replied. And my offer still stands on the table. I don't retract my bids lightly. Catherine offered a faint, cryptic smile. I'm not accepting, but I'm not declining either. I need to think. Alex's eyes darkened with approval. Take your time. I know how to wait. He turned, got back into the SUV, and the car glided away into the night. Catherine stood alone in the center of her courtyard. The street lamp cast a sharp halo of light at her feet. She looked at the dark windows of Derek's house, then out toward the winding road of the estate. Her eyes grew icy, and she whispered to the wind, "This is only the beginning." The following morning, in the executive suite of the Zenith Investment Syndicate, the project management room was a sprawling glass cube that overlooked the financial district, flooding the space with harsh, natural light. It felt expansive, but designed to make anyone sitting across the desk feel incredibly small. Catherine walked in, flanked by two sharp-suited corporate attorneys and her executive assistant. A junior staffer immediately stood at attention. Miss Sterling, the shortlisted contractors are waiting in the holding room. Catherine nodded smoothly. Bring them in. She took the center seat at the massive oak conference table. In front of her sat a thick binder, bristling with color-coded legal tabs. Seconds later, the double doors opened. Derek walked in, followed closely by Valerie and two VPs from his firm. The instant Derek and Catherine's eyes locked, the gravity in the room tripled. This was no longer a chance encounter at a gala. This was a tribunal. One side held the axe, the other had their neck on the block. Derek forced his face into a mask of professionalism. He pulled out a chair and sat down. Good morning, miss. Sterling, he said, his voice low and tight. The familiarity was dead. The corporate surrender had begun. Catherine showed zero emotion. Good morning, Mr. Vance. No smirk, no hesitation. She opened her binder and began with surgical precision. As of today, Apex Construction has been selected as one of the secondary contractors for the Zenith development. Every milestone will be audited aggressively against the investor-approved budget. Derek nodded, though the tension in his eyes was blinding. Understood. Catherine turned a page. However, there are structural modifications to your bid. She looked up, pinning him to his chair. Your current liquidity ratios are insufficient to handle the comprehensive macro package you initially proposed. One of Derek's VPs instantly jumped in, defensive. Miss Sterling, we have already restructured our capital. Catherine sliced him off without raising her voice. I have reviewed your filings. Your primary lender has placed a freeze on your credit lines. Your strategic equity partners have officially pulled out of the syndicate. She paused, letting the devastating facts bleed into the room. Her eyes sharpened. I will not leverage the future of this development on the back of an insolvent contractor. Dead silence. Derek's hands gripped his thighs under the table, but he forced his voice to stay level. What are your proposed modifications, Miss Sterling? Catherine delivered the killing blow without blinking. You will be awarded 30% of the initial scope. The remaining 70% will be reallocated to a competitor. It was a simple sentence, but to Derek, it was a gunshot to the chest. He knew exactly what this meant. If his scope was slashed to 30%, his profit margins would evaporate, and his firm's status as a major player in Silicon Valley would be completely castrated. But he was backed into a corner with a gun to his head. He had no choice. Agreed, he forced out through gritted teeth. Catherine gave a single nod and moved on to the next document. Sitting next to Derek, Valerie had remained entirely mute since walking in, but her eyes never left Catherine. She analyzed every microscopic movement, every tone of voice. This wasn't the weak, submissive housewife she had sneered at for years. This was an apex predator holding all the cards. A cold panic seized Valerie's chest. She lowered her eyes, slid her phone under the table, and frantically typed out a text to an underworld private investigator she kept on retainer. I need every single piece of dirt you can find on Catherine Sterling. Dig into everything. The meeting dragged on for a brutal hour. As the room finally began to empty, Catherine remained in her seat, calmly signing off on compliance forms. Derek deliberately slowed his pace, letting his team walk out ahead of him. He stepped back toward the table, his voice a low rumble. I need a moment to speak with you privately. Catherine didn't look up from her paperwork. If this pertains to the contract, send a memo to my legal team. It's not about the contract, he said, his voice cracking slightly. Catherine stopped writing. She slowly looked up, meeting his eyes. A suffocating pause hung in the air. Make it quick, she commanded. Derek took a jagged breath, as if trying to excavate the right words from his chest. Hate. The single syllable left his mouth, and he instantly knew he had made a fatal error. Catherine cut him down immediately. Mr. Vance. Her voice plunged to absolute zero. There is no Kate in this room. Derek went rigid. Catherine stood up, towering over the table, staring him down. We are business associates. That is the beginning and the end of it. She enunciated every word like a judge delivering a death sentence. Do not blur the lines. The reality crashed down on him. There was no going back. Derek couldn't formulate a single word. He stood there, hollowed out, watching her turn her back and walk out of the boardroom. A toxic bile rose in his throat, not because she had rejected his plea, but because he finally realized that in her universe, he had been reduced to absolute zero. Out in the hallway, Valerie was pacing. Seeing Derek emerge looking like a ghost, she hurried over. Are you okay? She asked, her voice shrill. Derek ignored her completely, stalking past her toward the elevators with a curt. Back to the office. Valerie glared at the empty space where Catherine had disappeared. Her eyes turned black with venom. Her survival instincts were screaming, if I don't neutralize her, I am going to lose everything. Back in her sprawling corner office, Catherine stood by the window, watching the ant-like traffic of San Francisco below. Helen slipped into the room and murmured, Miss Sterling, the bait was taken exactly as you predicted. Catherine didn't turn around. I know. Her voice was soft, but laced with iron. This is just the opening act. Her eyes narrowed at the skyline. The chessboard was completely flipped. And this time, she was moving all the pieces. The next morning, the corporate atmosphere at Apex Construction was a nightmare. Employees speed-walked through the cubicles, speaking in hushed, terrified whispers. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Outside the glass lobby doors, a black government-issue SUV pulled up. 3 men in cheap, stiff suits stepped out, led by a man holding a leather briefcase. The receptionist at the front desk scrambled to her feet, her voice trembling. "Good morning. Can I help you?" The lead agent flipped open a badge wallet. His voice was clinical and loud enough to carry. Securities and Exchange Commission, Joint Task Force with the IRS. We are here to execute an audit regarding the financial disclosures for the Nova Vista residential project. The entire lobby froze. The news ricocheted through the company's Slack channels in seconds. Up in the executive suite, Derek had just poured a cup of black coffee when his office door violently swung open. The head of legal charged in, sweating through his shirt. "Derek, we have federal auditors in the lobby." Derek froze, his coffee cup hovering. "Auditors? For Nova Vista? Why?" "They're citing credible evidence of massive financial fraud and embezzlement." A beat of dead silence. Derek slammed his cup down. "That's insane. The books on that project were closed and audited internally months ago." "They have a federal subpoena, Derek," the lawyer hissed. Derek's jaw locked. "Put them in conference room B." 10 minutes later, the air in conference room B was glacial. The lead SEC investigator sat across from Derek, calmly flipping through a massive dossier. "Mr. Vance," the agent began, his tone devoid of any humanity. "Following a preliminary forensic deep dive, we have uncovered a systemic pattern of opaque expenditures and ghost vendor payouts during the lifespan of the Nova Vista build." He slid a stack of highlighted documents across the glass table toward Derek. "Perhaps you can clarify these anomalies." Derek ripped the folder open. The very first page made his blood run cold. It was a massive wire transfer to an LLC he had never heard of, lacking any attached invoices. Page 2. A subcontractor agreement with hyperinflated material costs. Page 3. A ledger of duplicated payouts to phantom consulting firms. He flipped through the pages frantically, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the paper. Derek's voice came out as a raspy croak. "I never authorized these." The agent stared at him with dead, shark-like eyes. "Your digital signature is on every single authorization form, Mr. Vance." The room temperature plummeted to freezing. Derek stared at the paper again. Yes. The cryptographic signatures were his. There was no denying it. But he had absolutely no memory of vetting or approving these massive cash bleeds. Sitting in the corner of the room, completely silent, was Valerie. She was slightly pale, but her face remained locked in a mask of concerned professionalism. She chimed in, her voice dripping with fake helpfulness. "Agent, perhaps there was a massive glitch in our accounting software's auto-reconciliation. We will launch an immediate internal review." The agent didn't even look at her. "We will be seizing all hard drives, physical ledgers, and server access immediately." He paused, looking back at Derek. "And Mr. Vance, until this investigation yields a formal conclusion, your assets are frozen, and you are strongly advised not to leave the state of California." The words hit Derek like a baseball bat to the skull. He didn't argue. He just gave a hollow nod, his eyes completely glazed over. An hour later, the feds packed up their briefcases and left the room. Derek remained glued to his chair, staring blindly at the scattered documents. Every number, every fake vendor, every signature. It was a flawless frame job. But he knew, deep in his gut, something was fundamentally wrong. The door clicked open, and Valerie slipped back inside. "Derek?" she called out softly. Derek slowly lifted his head. The look he gave her made Valerie physically recoil. "Did you know about this?" he asked. The volume of his voice was low, but the pressure behind it was crushing. Valerie instantly shook her head, eyes wide with manufactured panic. "No, I just found out when they walked in the door." She hurried over to the table, her voice shifting into a frantic, soothing purr. "Derek, it has to be the accounting team. Someone in finance cooked the books. I'm going to rip the department apart and find out who did this." Derek cut her off with a stare. For the first time in years, the fog of manipulation lifted, and a crystal-clear suspicion took root in his brain. These specific vendor files, he said, tapping the paper. You were the one managing the prep work for these accounts, weren't you? Valerie's fingers twitched, but she held her ground. I only gathered the raw data from the project managers. You were the one who gave the final sign-off. It was a flawless pivot, slipping the noose directly back onto his neck. Derek didn't ask another question. He stared at her for a long, agonizing minute before turning his head away. Get out. Valerie hovered for a second, then turned and walked out of the conference room. The second the door shut, her victimized expression vanished, replaced entirely by a cold, reptilian calculation. At that exact moment, in the sprawling Atherton mansion across the bay, Catherine sat in her home office. On her massive oak desk sat a dossier identical to the one the SEC had just handed Derek. Only hers was completely unredacted and vastly more detailed. She flipped through the pages, her eyes utterly devoid of pity. Helen stood nearby, offering a quiet update. The federal auditors have commenced their raid on the Apex servers. Catherine nodded. Right on schedule. Helen hesitated before asking, Do you want me to leak the secondary evidence cache to the authorities? Catherine paused, her manicured finger resting on a bank statement. It was a ledger of offshore shell company transactions directly linking Valerie Pierce to the ghost vendors. It was a smoking gun, undeniable and absolute. But Catherine didn't make the call. She snapped the folder shut. Not yet, she murmured softly. Let them tear each other apart first. She stood up, walked to her balcony, and looked out over the fog rolling toward the city. Over there, a man was being sucked into a vortex of absolute ruin, and he didn't even know who had pulled the plug. You thought betrayal came cheap, Catherine whispered, the California wind catching her words. Her eyes were terrifyingly calm. Now you pay the invoice. A completely different chess match was playing out. Slow, surgical, and absolutely merciless. Late that evening, in the warm, ambient light of Catherine's study, the silence was broken only by the rhythmic clicking of a mouse. Catherine sat in front of her dual monitors, analyzing the final data dump her grandfather's corporate intelligence team had just secured. Helen stood quietly by her side. Miss Sterling, the forensic accountants have finished unpacking the offshore routing, Helen reported softly. Catherine opened the master file. A massive spreadsheet materialized. The ultimate beneficiary of the shell companies. Valerie Pierce. The numbers were staggering. Next file, the inflated subcontractor agreements. The vendor was a dummy LLC incorporated in Delaware, its registered agent one step removed from Valerie's maiden name. Catherine clicked to the next tab. A master list of duplicated invoices, some padded by over 200%. The common denominator in every single fraudulent transaction was Valerie. She didn't just embezzle, Helen noted in disgust. She acted as the shadow broker, coordinating kickbacks with half a dozen sub-tier suppliers. Catherine gave a slow nod, and Derek was completely blind to it, Helen added. According to the digital forensics, he likely had no idea. Catherine leaned back, her eyes locking onto the final summary line. The total amount siphoned into Valerie's personal accounts over the last 12 months was a figure large enough to trigger federal racketeering charges. She got greedy, Catherine said. No anger. No shock. Just an autopsy of human nature. Helen looked at her boss. How do you want to play this, ma'am? Catherine tapped her index finger against the mahogany desk. 1, 2. Then she spoke with chilling precision. Package 20% of this data and anonymously email it directly to Derek's private server. Helen blinked, slightly surprised. Only 20%? Just enough to confirm his paranoia, Catherine said, staring at the glowing monitors. But not enough to give him the full picture. Let him confront her with a loaded gun but no bullets. Helen understood instantly. This wasn't the execution. This was lighting the fuse on the bomb and locking them in the room together. The next morning, inside Derek's office, he sat slumped at his desk, staring blankly at the SEC audit files he had been agonizing over all night. His private laptop pinged. A secure, encrypted email had bypassed the company firewall. No sender name. The subject line simply read, I think you need to see this. Derek frowned, clicking open the attachment. A zip file of PDFs downloaded. He opened the first document. Within 5 seconds, the blood drained from his face. He frantically clicked through the rest of the files. Every page was a jagged puzzle piece, and the picture forming was monstrous. His fists clenched so tightly, his fingernails bit into his palms. "This is impossible," he whispered in the empty room. The name plastered across the routing numbers and wire approvals wasn't an anonymous vendor. It was Valerie Pierce. The office door swung open, and Valerie breezed in. She wore a sympathetic, gentle smile. "Derek." I stayed up all night prepping the defense files for the audit team. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw his face. It wasn't just stressed. It was a mask of pure, homicidal coldness. Derek didn't say a word. He simply spun his laptop around so the screen faced her. "Look at this." Valerie walked over, leaning in to read the screen. It took her exactly one glance. Her entire body locked up, but she forced her survival instincts into overdrive. "What is this supposed to be?" she asked, injecting a perfect amount of confusion into her voice. Derek stood up slowly, looking her dead in the eye. "That's exactly what I'm asking you." The air in the room turned toxic. Valerie shook her head, taking a step back. "I don't understand." "Derek, someone is trying to frame the company. Someone is feeding you fabricated data. Frame the company? Or frame me?" Derek's voice dropped to a terrifying octave. "And why the hell is your name buried in the metadata of every single fraudulent wire transfer?" Valerie hesitated for a fraction of a second, then launched her counteroffensive. She stepped forward, her voice breaking with desperate urgency. "You don't believe me?" She reached out and grabbed his forearms. "I have bled for this company since the day we were operating out of a garage. I have been by your side through everything. If I wanted to destroy you, why would I do this?" It was a masterclass in manipulation. The logic was sound, the tears in her eyes looked incredibly real. If this were 6 months ago, Derek would have folded and apologized. But today, he just stared at her fingers digging into his sleeves. He violently ripped his arms away. "I'm bringing in an outside forensic team to verify these files," he said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. That single sentence was a canyon opening up between them. Valerie stood frozen, the panic finally breaching her eyes. She knew the trust was dead. And outside in the bullpen, the sharks were already circling. Whispers echoed over the cubicle walls. "I heard the SEC is looking directly at Valerie. If she goes down, the whole firm is going under." Poor Derek. The gossip wasn't loud, but it was a suffocating pressure cooker. Simultaneously, in the Atherton mansion, Catherine stood by her window, holding a cup of Earl Grey tea. Her burner phone vibrated on the table. A single text from an automated tracker. Payload opened at target IP. Catherine set the phone down. She looked out across the bay toward the financial district. Her expression completely detached. "It started," she whispered. The masks were melting off, and this time, the collateral damage was going to be biblical. That afternoon, the tension inside Apex Construction's main boardroom was stretched to the snapping point. Every department head was seated. The table was littered with SEC audit summaries and the freshly printed leaked documents. No one spoke. No one made eye contact. Derek stood at the head of the table. The arrogant swagger that had defined him for years was completely gone. "Today, I want one thing made crystal clear," he began, his voice heavy as lead. He shoved the stack of leaked wire transfers into the center of the table. "Who is going to explain these off-book expenditures to me?" The executives exchanged terrified glances, but the room remained dead silent. Valerie sat in her usual seat to his right. Outwardly, she was composed, but her hands were clasped so tightly in her lap her knuckles ached. Derek slowly turned his head to look at her. Valerie. Just her name. But it was enough to turn every single head in the room toward her like a firing squad. Valerie looked up, her voice a fragile, trembling whisper. "Derek, I'm looking into this just like you are. It has to be a catastrophic glitch in the accounting software." The head of accounting instantly jumped up, his face red with indignation. "Derek, my department executes wires strictly based on authorized dockets." Before the accountant could finish, Derek barked. "And who handed you those dockets?" The accountant clamped his mouth shut. Every eye in the room slowly drifted back to Valerie. The silence screamed the answer. Valerie took a shaky breath and slowly stood up. I won't deny that I processed the paperwork, she said, desperately trying to keep her voice from shaking. But I was following general executive directives. Whose directives? Derek demanded, his voice echoing off the glass walls. The room held its breath. Valerie looked him right in the eye for 2 agonizing seconds. Then, she dropped her head, her voice cracking into a sob. I was just trying to help the company keep its head above water. A tear slipped down her cheek. I didn't think it would spiral into this. A few executives in the room exchanged uncertain looks. Maybe she really was just trying to fix a cash flow issue? Valerie has been here forever. Maybe she's just a scapegoat. The psychological tide in the room wavered for a split second. Derek stared at her. Some pathetic, lingering remnant of the man who loved her still wanted to believe the tears. Explain yourself. Right now, he said, his voice dropping slightly. Valerie seized the opening like a starving wolf. I was backed into a corner, she cried, wiping her eyes. Outside contractors were threatening to halt the builds if we didn't expedite the shadow bonuses. I altered the ledgers to keep the project from collapsing. She looked up at him with wide, tragic eyes. I was just trying to protect you, Derek. It was a surgical strike to Derek's ego and his lingering guilt. He fell silent. The atmosphere in the room began to shift back in her favor. And at that exact, perfectly timed second, the heavy glass doors to the boardroom swung wide open. Everyone whipped around. Catherine Sterling walked in. She wore an immaculate beige power suit, her heels clicking methodically against the floor. She didn't announce herself, but her sheer presence violently altered the room's atmospheric pressure. Half the executives instinctively stood up out of sheer deference. Miss Sterling. Catherine gave a minimalist nod, her eyes sweeping the room. Am I interrupting? She asked, her voice silky but laced with titanium. Nobody dared answer. She walked straight to the center of the table and dropped a thick, black leather folder onto the glass. If this firm is discussing systemic financial fraud regarding a project my syndicate is funding, I believe I have a right to a seat at the table. Derek stared at her, his jaw tight. This is an internal corporate matter, he said defensively. Catherine didn't blink. It is an internal matter that directly jeopardizes a billion-dollar development I control. It was an airtight justification. No one could throw her out. Catherine flipped open the black folder. These are the unredacted copies of your shadow transactions over the past 90 days, she announced smoothly. She began turning the pages, reading off the data like a prosecutor reading a death warrant. Receiver accounts, dummy LLCs, offshore routing numbers. Every single line of data she recited was absolute, mathematically undeniable proof. And Valerie's name was the connective tissue binding it all together. The boardroom descended into the silence of a graveyard. Valerie stood frozen, the color completely washing out of her face. No. That's fabricated, she stammered, her voice thin and reedy. Catherine didn't even look at her. She slid a single sheet of paper across the glass directly to Derek. This is a subcontractor agreement with a 300% markup on raw steel. The authorizing signature is yours, Derek. But the metadata proves the contract was drafted and uploaded by her terminal. Catherine finally turned her icy gaze onto Valerie. And this, she dropped another document on the table, is the Cayman Islands account where the bloated margins were funneled. The account holder is Valerie Pierce. It was a fatal strike. Every escape route was instantly bricked up. Valerie took a stumbling step backward. No, I didn't do this. She shook her head, but the performance had collapsed. Derek stared at the Cayman bank statement, then slowly looked up at Valerie. His eyes were black holes. Do you have anything else to say? He asked. The whisper was colder than the grave. Valerie looked at him, then looked around the room. The executives were staring at her with absolute disgust. She realized instantly that the soap opera was over. The tears dried up immediately. Her posture stiffened, and her expression morphed into a mask of pure, vicious venom. Fine, she sneered, dropping the volume of her voice so low it sent chills through the room. I did it. No more crying, no more shaking, just cold-blooded arrogance. But if you hadn't blindly signed every piece of paper put in front of you, could I have pulled it off? She glared at Derek with naked contempt. The words slashed through him like a machete. Derek stood paralyzed, his mouth slightly open. Do you really think you're clean, Derek? She spat, her voice dripping with malice. You either didn't know because you're an incompetent CEO, or you pretended not to know because you liked the cash flow. The room practically exploded with silent shock. Executives stopped breathing. No one dared to move a muscle. Catherine stood perfectly still by the table. Her expression hadn't changed a millimeter, as if this brutal implosion had been scripted down to the very letter. Derek's fists shook violently at his sides. For the first time in his life, a horrifying reality crystallized in his brain. The woman he had thrown away his marriage for, the woman he trusted above all others, had gleefully dragged him to the slaughterhouse. The betrayal was staring him in the face, undeniable and absolute. The room was dead silent, and this time, there wasn't a single soul left on Valerie's side. By the next morning, the corporate atmosphere at Apex Construction was a funeral dirge. The news of yesterday's boardroom bloodbath had already leaked to the financial press. They didn't even need journalists. The vicious rumors tearing through Silicon Valley's back channels were enough to incinerate the firm's stock value. A senior VP practically sprinted into Derek's office. Derek, Apex Construction's primary backer, just emailed a formal termination of our partnership agreement. Before Derek could even process the hit, his phone buzzed. Another VP standing in the doorway looked sick. Alpha Trust just pulled out of the San Jose subproject. Derek stood rigid behind his desk, leaning his weight on his knuckles until they popped. What was their reasoning? He asked, his voice hollow. They cited a critical need to reevaluate the ethical and financial transparency of our firm. The VP quoted the email, the corporate polite speak failing to mask the brutal insult. Derek let out a dry, hacking laugh. Transparency. Overnight, the empire he had bled to build for years was vaporizing in front of his eyes. The heavy glass door to his office suddenly swung open. Valerie Pierce walked in. She didn't look like the flawless, manicured executive she used to be. Her hair was slightly disheveled. Her makeup wasn't pristine, but her eyes were lit with a cornered, feral desperation. She scanned the room, ignoring the VPs, and locked eyes with Derek. Derek, she said, her voice devoid of its usual honey. Derek slowly stood up. Their eyes met. There wasn't an ounce of trust left, only miles of toxic wasteland and mutual paranoia. Why the hell are you in this building? Derek asked, his voice like grinding stones. Valerie offered a twisted, cynical smile. I think we need to have a very transparent conversation. We have nothing to talk about, Derek fired back. Oh, I think we do, she countered, stepping further into the room and slamming a flash drive onto his desk. This contains off-site backups of every transaction I ever facilitated. Derek frowned, his eyes narrowing. What are you getting at? Valerie leaned over the desk, looking him dead in the eye. If you throw me to the SEC wolves, I won't hesitate to drag you straight to hell with me. She didn't scream it, but the threat froze the air in the room. The two VPs quietly backed out of the office and shut the door, wanting absolutely zero part in the fallout. Derek stared at the flash drive. He didn't touch it. Are you blackmailing me in my own office? Valerie tilted her head. No, I'm just establishing a mutually assured destruction pact. She paused, her voice dripping with poison. Do you honestly believe that if the feds crack this wide open, a judge is going to let the CEO walk away clean? It was a strike to his most vulnerable artery. Derek's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ground together. You need to get the hell out of my building right now, he ordered, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. I never want to see your face again. Valerie stared at him for a long beat, then let out a sharp, mocking laugh. Fine. She nodded, her composure terrifying. I'll leave. She turned and walked toward the glass doors. But right before she stepped out, she paused and looked back over her shoulder. But do you really think this is where the bleeding stops, Derek? The question hung like toxic gas in the air. Then, she walked out. The door clicked shut, leaving the office suffocatingly empty. By mid-afternoon, Derek's phone was ringing incessantly. He answered an unsaved number. Derek, it's Richard. Our syndicate is suspending all joint ventures. Once your legal situation stabilizes, we can revisit. Click. A minute later, another call. Sorry, Vance. My board won't let me assume the liability. Click. Every single phone call was a bridge burning. Derek dropped his phone onto the desk. The screen went black. The office was dead quiet. He sank into his ergonomic chair, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, he fully grasped the reality of his situation. The collapse wasn't an external attack. The rot was entirely internal. Outside on the sidewalk, a group of shell-shocked employees huddled together, smoking and whispering. "Did you hear Valerie got escorted out by security? This place is going to file Chapter 11 by Friday. I'm updating my LinkedIn. Honestly, I feel bad for Mr. Vance." The murmurs weren't loud, but they carried the unmistakable scent of a dying company. At that exact moment, high up on a balcony in Atherton, Catherine stood looking across the bay toward the city skyline. Her expression wasn't triumphant or gloating. It was perfectly, terrifyingly serene. Helen stepped out onto the patio. "Miss Sterling, the remaining equity partners have officially pulled their capital from Apex, just as you modeled." Catherine nodded slowly. "I know." She looked a little further out toward the fog bank. "This is just the first wave." Her voice was soft, yet forged in titanium. Across the bay, a man was being systematically stripped of everything he owned piece by piece, contract by contract. And this time, there was absolutely no one standing behind him to break his fall. 3 days later, the Fairmont in San Francisco, a colossal real estate and tech summit, swarming with venture capitalists, multinational developers, and a horde of financial journalists. From the grand foyer to the main auditorium, the flashbulbs popped, cameras rolled, and the atmosphere hummed with brutal, high-stakes competition. Above the main stage, a massive LED screen glowed with the title, Project Zenith, the next horizon of Silicon Valley. On the VIP guest list, Alex Mercer's name was listed at the absolute top. Outside the hotel, a fleet of black SUVs pulled up. Alex Mercer stepped out first. He wore a razor-sharp black Tom Ford suit, his posture impeccably straight, his eyes scanning the crowd with casual, terrifying dominance. A second later, the opposite door opened, and Catherine Sterling emerged. She wore a minimalist, blindingly white cocktail dress. No flashy diamonds, no overt branding, but she radiated an effortless, old-money elegance that commanded the street. They stood side by side on the red carpet. They didn't hold hands, they didn't touch, but their combined gravity was a black hole that pulled every eyeball in the vicinity toward them. A reporter from Bloomberg recognized her and violently elbowed his cameraman. "That's her, the phantom proxy from the boardroom. She's with Mercer, get the shot." Camera shutters fired like machine guns. Alex leaned in slightly, his voice a low rumble meant only for her. "You're going to be the center of the universe today." Catherine didn't bat an eye. "I've been preparing for it." Alex looked at her for a split second, his eyes flashing with deep respect. "Excellent." He extended his arm not to hold her hand, but in a polite, inviting gesture. "Shall we?" Catherine walked perfectly in step with him. They entered the grand lobby side by side. At that exact moment, they didn't need a PR team to issue a press release. Everyone in the room instantly understood that Catherine Sterling had stepped permanently out of the shadows. Inside the auditorium, financial bloggers were already rapid-firing tweets and urgent articles. Push notifications lit up the iPhones of half the attendees in the room. Billionaire Alex Mercer and mystery proxy, Catherine Sterling take center stage at Zenith Summit. The paparazzi photo of them walking through the doors went viral across LinkedIn and Twitter instantly. Miles away, in the desolate, half-empty offices of Apex Construction, Derek stood frozen. Behind his desk, his phone gripped in his hand. He was staring at the screen, reading the Forbes alert, staring at the photo of Catherine standing shoulder to shoulder with Alex Mercer. The physical proximity, the shared, untouchable calm on their faces. She was no longer the woman who stayed up until 2 a.m. waiting for him to come home. Derek squeezed the phone until the glass screen protector cracked. A suffocating wave of nausea hit him, not anger, but pure, agonizing inadequacy. He muttered, but the words died in his throat. Outside his door, 2 of his remaining junior employees were packing cardboard boxes. One whispered to the other, "I read on Twitter that this Catherine Sterling woman is the one actually running the Zenith Capital. If she's side by side with Mercer, they've got to be more than just business partners." The words bled through the glass into Derek's office. He kicked his door shut and roared, "Get back to work!" The bullpen fell dead, silent, but it was the silence of a morgue. Back at the Fairmont, the summit was in full swing. Alex Mercer stood at the podium, commanding the room as he laid out the macroeconomic vision for the Zenith development. His voice was deep, precise, and absolute. As he wrapped up his segment, he turned toward the front row. For the next phase of our presentation, I'd like to invite the lead representative of the Sterling Syndicate to the stage. Catherine Sterling. The entire auditorium shifted its collective focus. Catherine rose from her seat, her movements fluid and unhurried. No stage fright. No hesitation. She took the microphone, looking out over a sea of billionaires and power brokers. "We are not merely capitalizing a real estate project," she began, her voice echoing with crystal clarity. "We are establishing a new baseline for corporate accountability and sustainable infrastructure." The entire room hung on her every word. No one was looking at her like a novelty anymore. They were looking at an apex predator. As the summit concluded, Alex stood next to Catherine during the press junket. A reporter from the Wall Street Journal shoved a recorder forward. "Mr. Mercer, can you clarify the exact nature of your relationship with Miss Sterling?" The air in the press pit paused for a fraction of a second. Alex didn't dodge the microphone. He looked directly into the camera lenses. "She is a critical partner." He paused, a faint, dangerous smile touching his lips. "And she is someone I trust implicitly." A short, incredibly loaded answer. It was more than enough to send the rumor mill into hyperdrive. Catherine added nothing. She simply stood beside him, poised and unbothered, neither confirming nor denying the implication. That evening, back in the quiet wealth of Atherton, Derek stood in his front courtyard, staring at the massive estate across the street. The lights were blazing. His mind played the footage he had streamed online over and over again. Catherine on the summit stage. Catherine standing next to Alex Mercer. It was a reality his brain physically rejected. He dug his fingernails into his palms. The agonizing ache in his chest wasn't about losing the Zenith contract or his company's stock plummeting. It was the agonizing realization that the woman he thought would always be his safety net was entirely out of his league. "Since when?" he whispered into the dark. No one answered. Only the wind rustled the California oaks, and on the other side of the street, Catherine stood by her floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out into the night. Her phone screen glowed on the console table, flooded with dozens of texts from Fortune 500 CEOs begging for a meeting. She didn't rush to answer any of them. She just stood there. Behind her, a completely new life had opened up, and this time, she wasn't looking in the rearview mirror. Night had fully settled over the elite enclave of Atherton. It was dead quiet. The soft, amber glow of the streetlights spilled across the private avenues, stretching the shadows of the massive oak trees swaying gently in the coastal breeze. Derek Vance stood on the sidewalk, directly in front of the towering iron gates of the estate across the street. He had been standing there for nearly 10 minutes. He didn't buzz the intercom, but he didn't walk away either. The private security patrol drove past and glanced at him a few times, but no one intervened. Anyone with eyes could see this was a man paralyzed by his own hesitation. A rare, pathetic sight. Suddenly, the heavy iron gates clicked and smoothly glided open. Catherine Sterling walked out. She had changed out of her power suit. She wore a simple, elegant cashmere sweater and slacks. Her hair pulled into a loose, comfortable clip. She stopped when she saw Derek hovering on the pavement. There was no shock in her eyes, no lingering resentment. Just absolute, terrifying indifference. "Why are you here?" she asked. Her voice was light, completely devoid of emotional weight. Derek took a hesitant step forward. "I want to talk." "We can talk right here," she replied. She didn't invite him inside, didn't close the physical distance. She maintained a flawless, impenetrable boundary. Derek stared at her. 1 second. 2. Then his voice cracked. "Kate?" He paused, seemingly trying to summon whatever shreds of courage he had left. "I'm sorry." The silence hung heavy in the air. The wind caught the edge of Catherine's sweater. She didn't react immediately. She just looked at him, her gaze utterly unshaken. Derek pushed forward, his voice turning raw and gravelly. "I know I was wrong." He clenched his fists, staring at the pavement. "About everything before. I never should have treated you the way I did." For the first time in his life, He wasn't spinning a PR narrative, wasn't shifting the blame, wasn't making excuses. He just said it. Catherine listened. She didn't interrupt, she didn't argue, she didn't cry. She just stood there, looking at him as if listening to a stranger ask for directions. After a long, agonizing pause, she finally spoke. Her voice was incredibly quiet. "Are you apologizing because you realized you lost me? Or because you realized you lost your leverage?" The question dropped. It wasn't screamed. It wasn't vicious, but it was surgical. Derek flinched. The look in his eyes scrambled. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but nothing came out because, deep down, he didn't even know the answer himself. His brain was a blender of the past few weeks. The SEC raids, the mass exodus of his investors, the bankruptcy looming over his firm, and the image of Catherine standing on a pedestal he could never reach. It was all tangled together. Inseparable. Toxic. He tried to speak again, but his vocal cords failed. Catherine watched him struggle. Her eyes remained impossibly calm. There was no disappointment left in her. No lingering desire for him to prove himself. There were simply no expectations left to break. "You can't answer," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a clinical diagnosis. Derek slowly lowered his head. For the first time in his life, he didn't try to argue his way out of a corner. He started. But Catherine cut him off gently. "You don't need to explain anything else." She said it effortlessly, but with absolute finality. Because no matter what answer he gave, it wouldn't change a single atom of reality. The street fell dead silent. Derek looked up at her. His eyes were completely stripped of the arrogant, entitled CEO he used to be. It was the look of a man who was finally waking up to the catastrophic magnitude of what he had thrown in the garbage. Can we start over?" he asked. The whisper was fragile, pathetic, and terrified. Catherine tilted her head slightly. She looked at him for exactly 1 second, then slowly shook her head. "No." Just one syllable. No hesitation. No softening of the blow. Derek froze. He had anticipated the rejection, but hearing it said with such effortless detachment felt like taking a bullet to the ribs. Catherine turned around to walk back through the gates. "If that's all, you should go." She didn't say it with malice, but she wasn't lingering to watch him bleed either. Derek didn't leave immediately. He stood rooted to the concrete, staring at her back as she walked up the driveway. An agonizing, suffocating emotion clawed at his throat, an emotion he didn't have a name for. The heavy gates clicked shut and locked. Derek was left completely alone on the sidewalk. The California night wind felt unusually freezing. He suddenly realized a brutal truth. There are some things in this world that, once discarded, you can never, ever buy back. And this time, he was the one left standing in the dust. Deep into the night. Inside Catherine Sterling's mansion, the light in her private study was still burning. Catherine sat behind her massive oak desk. In front of her lay 2 thick dossiers. On the left, the unredacted, decrypted wire fraud, evidence of every single financial crime, wire fraud, and SEC violation committed within Derek Vance's company. On the right, the finalized strategy to nuke him from orbit. If she wanted to, all she had to do was send one email to the federal prosecutor, and every violation would be made public. Derek would have no legal avenues left. He wouldn't just lose his company, he would likely lose his freedom. Catherine rested her hand on top of the left folder. Her manicured fingers tapped the leather cover, then stopped. She didn't open it. She leaned back into her ergonomic leather chair and stared out the window. Across the bay, the San Francisco skyline was still glittering. Cars were moving on the highway. The world kept spinning. Only she was standing on the precipice. To finish the execution or to walk away. A soft knock tapped on the heavy wooden door. "Come in," Catherine said. Helen entered carrying a silver tray with a porcelain teacup. "Miss Sterling, you haven't retired for the evening?" Catherine shook her head slightly. "I still have some loose ends to tie up." Helen placed the tray on the desk. Her eyes flicked to the 2 dossiers and she instantly understood the gravity of the moment, but she didn't pry. She simply murmured, "Sometimes, what we hold in our hands and refuse to let go of becomes its own kind of prison, ma'am." Catherine didn't reply verbally. She just gave a faint, acknowledging nod. Helen bowed her head and slipped out of the room. The study plunged back into absolute silence. Suddenly, her private cell phone vibrated on the desk. A text message. "I'm outside." Catherine looked at the screen. She didn't have to guess who it was. She stood up, grabbed a lightweight trench coat, and walked downstairs. Out in the courtyard, under the ambient glow of the security lights, stood Alex Mercer. He didn't text again or ring the buzzer. He simply waited with infinite patience for her to emerge. Catherine pulled her coat tightly around her shoulders and walked slowly toward the gate. "Is this a business call at 1 a.m.?" she asked, her tone dry. Alex looked at her through the iron bars. No probing, interrogating stares. Just quiet observation. "I had a feeling you'd still be awake," he said, his voice a low rumble. Catherine frowned slightly. "Are you always this good at guessing?" Alex let out a short, quiet laugh. "No. I've just sat in the exact chair you're sitting in right now." His words made her pause. He shifted his gaze toward the dark mansion across the street. When you hold the absolute power to destroy someone's life, it is remarkably difficult to take your finger off the trigger. The sentence wasn't delivered heavily, but it struck the absolute core of her dilemma. Catherine let out a slow, shaky exhale. "Do you think I'm hesitating out of weakness?" she asked. For the very first time, the bulletproof certainty in her voice wavered. "You're making a choice," Alex replied instantly. No flowery corporate speak, no judgment. Just looking the brutal truth right in the eye, Catherine looked down at her hands gripping the iron gate. "If I stop now, does it mean I lose?" Alex shook his head. "No." His voice was firm and absolute, stopping when you have the ammunition to annihilate them. That is what actually takes strength. He paused, stepping a fraction of an inch closer to the gate. "I don't need you to be ruthless to impress me, Catherine. I just need you to be free." It wasn't a billionaire's promise. It wasn't a contractual condition. It was just a simple, unadorned sentence. But it was enough to shatter the deepest armor she had built around her heart. Catherine lifted her head. Her eyes locked onto his. For the first time since they met, the calculated, invisible wall between them vanished. A cool Pacific breeze swept through the courtyard. She turned her head and took one final look at the mansion across the street. Over there was the past. The years she bled, sacrificed, and suffered in silence. She closed her eyes for a full second. When she opened them, the look in her pupils had fundamentally altered. The suffocating weight was gone. The toxic tether to the past had been severed. Catherine walked back into her study. She picked up the dossier containing the federal evidence, stared at the cover one last time, and then dropped it into the bottom drawer of her desk and locked it. She didn't open it. She didn't send the email. She chose not to pull the trigger. She walked back outside. Alex was still standing on the pavement. "I've made my decision," she said, her voice clear as crystal. "And?" Alex asked. His dark eyes locked on hers. Catherine looked at him, a genuine, weightless smile breaking across her face. "I don't need revenge anymore." A single sentence. It didn't mean she was surrendering. It meant she was finally dropping the corpse she had been carrying. Alex didn't grin like a teenager, but he gave a deep, approving nod. "Then let's start over." Catherine looked past the gates, down the long, winding road of the Enclave. The path ahead was long, but for the first time, the ghosts of the past weren't dragging her backward. One step, then another. She walked out of the gates, stepping completely out of the shadow of the woman she used to be. 3 weeks later, inside the corporate headquarters of Apex Construction, the frantic, high-stakes energy was completely dead. A handful of remaining employees were silently packing their belongings into cardboard boxes. The exhaustion on their faces was terminal. The cubicles were stripped bare, departments liquidated. Pinned to the digital bulletin board in the lobby was a sterile corporate memo. Company operations temporarily suspended pending fiscal restructuring. But everyone in Silicon Valley knew that was just PR spin for bankruptcy. Inside the CEO's glass office, Derek Vance sat entirely alone. The mahogany desk was buried under a mountain of final notices, unpaid vendor invoices, bank defaults, massive legal retainers. The debt had snowballed into an avalanche. There were 0 lifelines left. The desk phone rang, shattering the dead silence. Derek picked up the receiver like a zombie. "Mr. Vance, this is Capital Trust. We are officially initiating the foreclosure protocol on your leveraged assets, The voice on the other end announced with robotic efficiency. Derek closed his eyes. "I know," he rasped. His voice was hollow. No fighting back. No desperate negotiating. The line went dead. He dropped the receiver back onto the cradle. The office was an absolute void. No more strategy meetings. No more pitch decks. Only the deafening roar of silence. That same evening, back in the elite enclave of Atherton, a generic moving truck idled in the driveway of Derek's massive estate. Nancy Vance stood by the open wrought iron gates, clutching a designer handbag, her face twisted in a mask of total disorientation. "Why do we have to leave?" "This is my house," she shrieked, her voice shaking violently. The bank's asset recovery agent stood on the porch with a clipboard, his tone devoid of pity. "Ma'am, this property was collateralized against corporate loans. Your son's firm is in default, and the bank is legally repossessing the asset." Nancy stumbled backward, her mouth hanging open. "No, that can't be right." She spun around, frantically grabbing Derek's arm as he walked out the front door with a single duffel bag. "Derek, say something. Tell him he's wrong." Derek stood paralyzed on the driveway. He didn't yell. He didn't explain. He didn't look at the bank rep. He just stared blankly at the sprawling mansion that used to symbolize everything he had conquered, a kingdom that no longer belonged to him. A week later, in a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a noisy, rundown neighborhood in San Jose, Nancy sat on a cheap plastic dining chair, aggressively fanning herself with a junk mail flyer. Deep bags hung under her eyes. "I am not built to live in a dump like this," she whined bitterly. "It's 90 degrees outside, and this piece of garbage window AC barely works." Derek sat on the edge of a sagging futon, staring blankly out the smeared window. Below, the street was crammed with rusted cars and blaring sirens. The pristine, insulated silence of Atherton was a million miles away. Nancy didn't stop. Her voice grew shrill and venomous. "This is all your fault. If you hadn't..." She choked on the words. She looked at her son's dead, empty eyes and swallowed the rest of the sentence. Because deep down, she knew exactly what she was about to say. There was no one left to blame but themselves. A month later, the Moscone Center in downtown San Francisco, the annual Global Real Estate and Tech Summit. The massive convention hall was packed to the gills with international conglomerates, angel investors, and financial media. Derek Vance stood at the very back of the cavernous hall. He wore a slightly wrinkled off-the-rack dress shirt. No bespoke blazer, no Rolex, no aura of arrogant invincibility. Nobody in the crowd recognized him. Or, if they did, they pretended he didn't exist. On the brightly lit main stage stood Catherine Sterling. Next to her, a step behind, was Alex Mercer. The stage lights caught her silhouette as she held the microphone. Her voice rang out, authoritative and crystal clear. "We are not just investing in concrete and steel. We are investing in sustainable, ethical corporate ecosystems." The entire auditorium was dead silent, hanging on her every word. No one doubted her anymore. No one underestimated the heiress of the Sterling Empire. Catherine stood on a summit that Derek had once believed she was utterly unqualified to even look at. He stood in the shadows at the back of the room, staring up at her, unable to tear his eyes away. An indescribable, agonizing emotion crushed his chest. He remembered the early days in that cramped apartment, when she quietly managed his chaotic ledgers, never asking for a single word of praise. He remembered the way she used to look at him with absolute, unwavering faith. And now, that gaze belonged to an entirely different universe. Derek let out a soft, self-deprecating chuckle. A bitter, agonizing laugh. Turns out, he whispered to the empty air around him. The one who had absolutely no idea what they were doing was me. No one heard him. No one cared. But for the very first time, he admitted the absolute truth. He hadn't just lost his net worth, his company, or his status. He had thrown away the most valuable human being that would ever walk into his life. The keynote ended. The auditorium erupted into a thunderous standing ovation. Catherine stepped down from the podium. As she walked toward the VIP exit, her eyes casually swept over the massive crowd. For a fraction of a second, her gaze landed on Derek standing in the shadows at the back of the room. They looked at each other. No blinding rage, no bitter resentment. just two people standing on two entirely divergent timelines. Catherine calmly looked away, her stride never slowing down. Derek remained rooted to the carpet. He didn't call out her name. He didn't try to push through the crowd. Because he finally understood that the chasm between them could never, ever be crossed again. The sun was setting outside the glass walls of the convention center. One chapter had permanently closed, and the invoice for his betrayal had been paid in full. A month later, the Sterling Corporate Empire headquarters. Top floor of the Transamerica Pyramid. The massive, circular boardroom was packed with every major shareholder and senior executive. The atmosphere was solemn, but it lacked the cutthroat anxiety of typical board meetings. Michael Sterling, the legendary patriarch, sat at the head of the table. He looked around the room, his voice gravelly and commanding. Today, I am officially announcing the new Chief Executive Officer of the Sterling Syndicate. He paused, letting the silence stretch, before turning his head to his right. Catherine Sterling. Every eye in the room locked onto her. Catherine stood up. She wore a flawless, slate-gray tailored suit, her hair pulled back sharply. The quiet, submissive girl from Atherton was dead and buried. In her place was an executive who perfectly, terrifyingly fit the throne she was about to sit on. Michael looked up at his granddaughter. His voice lost its corporate edge, growing warm and absolute. I believe in you, Kate. Catherine nodded, her eyes fierce. I will not let you down. No bloated speeches. No corporate jargon. One sentence was enough to cement her reign. The room erupted into genuine, sustained applause, not out of obligatory politeness to the boss's granddaughter, but because they had all watched her decapitate the competition over the last few months. In the days that followed, Catherine took the reins of the empire. Her schedule was a blur of back-to-back strategy meetings, aggressive acquisitions, and late-night conference calls. But she no longer felt like a ghost floating through someone else's life. Her hands were firmly on the steering wheel. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Alex Mercer walked into her corner office. He didn't bother knocking. He simply leaned against the mahogany doorframe, hands in his pockets, watching her type furiously on her laptop. The CEO looks a little swamped, he noted, a faint, teasing smirk in his voice. Catherine didn't look up from her screen. And you apparently have too much free time to just stand there guarding my door, she fired back smoothly. Alex chuckled, walking in and dropping a sleek black folder onto her desk. A new joint venture term sheet. I think you're going to like the multiples. Catherine finally stopped typing, flipped open the folder, and skimmed the executive summary. You still have a habit of moving aggressively fast, she noted. And you still have a habit of needing to control every variable, Alex replied, his voice dropping an octave. They looked at each other. They didn't need to play verbal chess anymore. The mutual understanding was just there, unforced, organic, and incredibly lethal. Later that evening, back in the quiet wealth of Atherton, the soft, ambient light spilled across the pristine pavement. Catherine stood by the iron gates of her estate. She looked across the street at the massive modern mansion. The lights were on, but different cars were in the driveway. The bank had flipped the house to a new tech executive. There were zero traces of the past left. It was nothing but a graveyard of memories. Alex Mercer stood right beside her. He didn't interrupt her thoughts. He just stood there, a solid, immovable presence in the cool night air. After a long silence, he finally spoke, his voice low and unhurried. If you had to do it all over again, would you have pulled the trigger on him? It wasn't a test. It wasn't a judgment, just a quiet question in the dark. Catherine didn't answer immediately. She looked down the long oak-lined avenue, taking a slow breath. Then, a genuine, quiet smile touched her lips. I choose myself, she said. Her voice was light, but the steel underneath it was unbreakable. Alex didn't say a word. He just waited until Catherine turned her head to look at him. Her sharp gaze softened beautifully as she held his eyes. And, quite possibly, you. The sentence was soft, lacking the aggressive certainty of her boardroom commands, but it was more than enough. It wasn't spoken out of necessity, or trauma, or leverage. It was spoken simply because she wanted to. Alex let out a low, genuine laugh. I can work with that. He didn't grab her hand. He didn't pull her into a cinematic embrace. He just stood by her side, But the massive, calculated distance that used to sit between them had entirely vanished. The California night wind swept past them. Catherine looked forward. The gravity of the past had finally let her go. She no longer had anything to prove to a ghost. She had walked through the fire, let the ashes blow away, and this time, she was choosing to build an empire for herself. A new beginning, weightless, but armed with absolute purpose. I used to think that the most terrifying thing a person could experience in this life was losing their wealth, their career, or their social status. But after witnessing enough trials by fire, I've realized something far more chilling. The most terrifying thing you can do is lose the one person who quietly sacrificed everything to build you up. Looking back at Catherine's story, one brutal truth crystallizes. When you have someone standing in your corner, swallowing their pride and quietly supporting your ambitions that isn't a given right, that is hitting the lottery. Sadly, too many people only realize they held a winning ticket after they've already thrown it in the trash. I've also learned that true power doesn't mean executing a flawless, scorched earth revenge. True power is having the ammunition to destroy someone, but choosing to drop the gun, walk away, and refuse to let their toxic history dictate your future. Sometimes, the ultimate victory isn't proving to the world how ruthless you can be. It's proving to yourself that you can find peace and thrive after walking through hell. There's a quote that always sticks with me. What you lose because you failed to appreciate it will never return simply because you learned to regret it. So, I leave you with this question. Is there someone in your life right now, quietly standing by your side in the trenches, whom you've forgotten to appreciate? If this story hit close to home, or made you reevaluate your own circle, leave a comment below. If you see things differently, I want to hear your perspective. And if you enjoy deep dive narratives like this, make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode.